5 Sumerian predictions for 2026 that scientists can't explain, and the third just happened. There is a library buried beneath the sand. Not a metaphor, not a legend. An actual library, pressed into clay tablets, sealed in ancient jars, and hidden inside the ruins of a civilization that was writing complex astronomical charts while most of the world was still figuring out fire. The Sumerians lived in what is now southern Iraq, in a region called Mesopotamia, roughly 6,000 years ago. And in that clay, in that pressed and baked and somehow surviving record, they left behind something that has made some of the most careful, credentialed scientists on Earth go very quiet. They left behind predictions, not vague prophecies like the kind you find on a fortune cookie or a cathedral wall. Specific predictions, astronomical, geological, biological. Predictions that describe events, cycles, and alignments that modern science only confirmed in the last 100 years and in some cases, the last decade. 5 of those predictions are what we are going to talk about today. And number 3 either already happened or it is happening right now in 2026 as you watch this. Before we get into it, if you are the kind of person who asks the questions that mainstream historians don't want asked, hit subscribe. This channel goes where the textbooks stop. Every week, we pull on the threads that unravel the official story, and we follow them wherever they go. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next, because what comes after this video is going to change the way you think about everything you were taught about early civilization. Now, let's go back 6,000 years. Let's go back to the beginning of everything we thought we knew. Most people, if they know anything about the Sumerians at all, know the basics. First civilization, cuneiform writing. Invented the wheel, somewhere in the Middle East. Move on. That framing does something very deliberate. It puts the Sumerians in a box labeled early humans figuring things out, and it keeps them there. Primitive, yes, clever, but primitive. Working things out slowly, the way we imagine cave people working out fire, trial, error, time. The problem with that framing is that the evidence doesn't support it. When archaeologists first began seriously excavating the Sumerian ruins in the mid-1800s, they expected to find the slow, grinding developmental arc of a culture working its way upward. What they found instead was something that looked, in the words of more than one excavation report, like it arrived fully formed. Sumerian civilization, as far as the archaeological record shows, didn't develop gradually, it appeared. Irrigation systems, legal codes, astronomical observatories, complex religious hierarchies, sophisticated mathematics, a functioning calendar system, a detailed understanding of the solar system, all of it shows up essentially simultaneously in the archaeological record around 4000 BCE. There is no developmental period that we can point to and say, here is where they were learning how to count, and then here is where they figured out multiplication, and then here is where they worked out the retrograde motion of Jupiter. The full system is just there, like it was installed. This has been called by scholars the Sumerian problem, and it is a real problem, not a fringe one. Peer-reviewed archaeological journals have wrestled with it. The consensus response, to the extent there is one, is to assume there must be a developmental period that we simply haven't found yet, that the evidence is buried somewhere, and that when we find it, the mystery will resolve. That's been the working assumption for about 150 years. The evidence hasn't turned up. What has turned up, instead, is more mystery. The Sumerians described their knowledge as a gift. They were very specific about this. They did not claim to have invented their civilization. They claimed it was given to them by beings they called the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki appear throughout Sumerian texts with a consistency and specificity that is hard to dismiss as pure mythology. They are described as beings who came from the sky, who taught the Sumerians agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, metallurgy, and law, who showed them how to build cities and how to organize social hierarchies, who explained the structure of the cosmos. Now, mainstream scholarship treats the Anunnaki as gods in the traditional sense, powerful deities invented to explain natural phenomena and provide social order, and that is certainly one interpretation of the texts. But there is another interpretation, one that a growing number of researchers, including some who came out of conventional academic backgrounds before their findings became too inconvenient, have begun to take seriously. And that interpretation is that the Sumerians were describing, in the literal language of their time, an encounter with a technologically advanced intelligence that gave them the foundations of civilization. We are not going to resolve that debate in this video. What we are going to do is something more interesting. We are going to look at what the Sumerians actually said, and we are going to hold it up against what we currently know, and we are going to ask one very simple question. How did they know that? Because when you ask that question about 5 specific Sumerian predictions, the answer mainstream science offers, lucky coincidence, or vague enough to fit anything, stops being credible. The Sumerian astronomical record. Before we get to the predictions, you need to understand what the Sumerians actually recorded, because the depth and accuracy of it is part of why the predictions are so unsettling. The Sumerians mapped the sky with a precision that shouldn't have been possible without telescopes. They tracked the movements of the planets in relation to fixed stars. They calculated the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cycle in the wobble of Earth's axis, which requires centuries of precise observation to even detect, let alone calculate. They knew the approximate distance between planets. They described Saturn with rings, which is physically invisible to the naked eye, without significant optical magnification. The tablet known as Mul, Apin, which dates to around 1200 BCE, but is believed to be a copy of much older records, contains star lists, planetary movement charts, and predictive astronomical tables that Babylonian and later Greek astronomers would spend centuries trying to recreate. Some of the predictive tables in Mul Apin weren't independently confirmed by modern astronomy until the 20th century. The Sumerians used a base, 6-0 numerical system that we still use today when we measure time: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. 360 degrees in a circle? These aren't arbitrary numbers. They come directly from the Sumerian mathematical system, which was itself based on astronomical ratios, the ratios of planetary cycles, orbital periods, and angular measurements. They also divided the zodiac into 12 sections, assigned specific characteristics to each, and used those sections to track both astronomical cycles and, they claimed, cycles of human events. The zodiac we use today, even in its most casual horoscope page form, is a direct inheritance from the Sumerian sky map. None of this has a satisfying conventional explanation. The standard story that prehistoric humans slowly accumulated observational knowledge over generations doesn't account for the sophistication and completeness of the Sumerian system from its earliest appearances in the record. Which brings us to the texts that contain the predictions. The Enuma Elish is the Sumerian creation epic, a set of clay tablets that describes the origins of the cosmos, the formation of the solar system, and the early history of Earth. It also contains what some researchers interpret as a timeline of coming events. The Atrahasis is an earlier text, probably the oldest written flood account in history, predating the biblical Genesis by over 1,000 years. It describes cycles of catastrophe and renewal, specific geological and astronomical triggers, and the behavior of the Anunnaki across vast timescales. The Tablets of Destiny are a more fragmented set of records, portions of which survive in the British Museum and in collections in Iraq. They describe, in astronomical and symbolic language, a sequence of events tied to specific celestial configurations. And then there are the texts associated with Enki, the Anunnaki figure most associated with knowledge, science, and what the Sumerians called the ME, the codes of civilization. The Enki texts are, in certain passages, startlingly specific about future events. They describe things in terms of astronomical cycles, planetary alignments, and what the texts call the return of the great time, a phrase that has kept more than a few scholars awake at night. We are going to look at 5 things these texts predicted. Things that have either already come true, are coming true right now, or are scheduled based on the celestial mechanics the texts describe for 2026 and just beyond. Let's start with the most distant in time and work our way forward. Prediction 1. The return of the destroyer. This is the prediction that, more than any other, has divided the research community. Not because it's vague, it's actually one of the most specific, but because its implications, if it's accurate, are civilization level. The Sumerians described a celestial body they called Nibiru. In some translations, Nibiru means crossing place or point of transition. In others, it has been translated as planet of the crossing, a body that periodically crosses the inner solar system on a highly elliptical orbit, passing through the plane of the ecliptic before returning to deep space. The Enuma Elish describes Nibiru in astronomical detail. It is described as a large body, reddish or fiery in appearance, that appears in the sky on a regular cycle. The Sumerians assigned it a cycle of what the text has been interpreted to mean 3,600 years, a period they called a shar. Here is where the mainstream science community gets uncomfortable. In 2003, 2 astronomers at the California Institute of Technology, not fringe researchers, not ancient astronaut theorists, but credentialed astrophysicists, published a paper that proposed the existence of a large, undiscovered planetary body in the outer solar system. They base this on perturbations in the orbits of known trans-Neptunian objects, objects in the far outer solar system that were being pulled by something whose gravitational influence could be measured but whose source couldn't yet be seen. This body became known, informally, as Planet 9, or Planet X. The research intensified. By 2016, the same researchers, Konstantin Batygin and Mike Brown at Caltech, had published a more formal analysis in the Astronomical Journal that made a compelling mathematical case for a planet roughly 10 times the mass of Earth on a highly elliptical orbit that takes it far beyond the reach of current telescopes for most of its cycle, but brings it back through the outer solar system periodically. The estimated orbital period of this hypothetical Planet 9, between 10,000 and 20,000 years, in most models, though some calculations have placed it as short as 3,600 to 4,800 years, there it is, sitting in peer-reviewed literature. The Sumerians said a large body on an elliptical orbit crosses back through the solar system on a cycle of 3,600 years. Modern astrophysicists, working from observational perturbations in the outer solar system, have proposed the existence of a large body on an elliptical orbit with a cycle that, in some models, falls right inside that range. The Sumerians also described what happened when Nibiru returned. They described disruption, tidal forces affecting Earth, increased volcanic and seismic activity, weather pattern changes, the behavior of certain animal populations, and eventually the appearance of the object itself in the sky. Zecharia Sitchin, the scholar who spent most of his life translating and interpreting Sumerian texts, and who remains controversial within academia for having taken the Anunnaki descriptions literally rather than mythologically, calculated that the last close passage of Nibiru based on the 3,600-year Shar cycle and the historical record would have been around 1,600 BCE. That date corresponds to significant geological and cultural disruptions in the ancient world: the eruption of Thera, the collapse of several Bronze Age civilizations, the Exodus narratives, and the dramatic shifts recorded in the Egyptian Ipuwer papyrus. The next Shar cycle, counting forward from 1,600 BCE at 3,600 years, would bring us to approximately 2000 CE, plus or minus a few decades for orbital variations and calculation uncertainty. And the predictions in the Enuma Elish don't describe the return as a sudden, single-day event. They describe a period of approach, a period of increasing effects. Preceding the visible appearance of the object, the texts describe geological unrest, changes in ocean behavior, increases in events the Sumerians called the shaking of the foundations, which many researchers interpret as seismic and volcanic activity. We are, right now, in the middle of what geologists are calling an unusual period of increased seismic and volcanic activity globally. The Hunga Tonga eruption in 2022 was, by some measurements, the largest explosion recorded by modern instruments in human history. Seismic events above magnitude 6 have increased measurably over the past 2 decades compared to the previous century's baseline. Deep ocean temperatures have risen in ways that oceanographers cannot fully account for with existing atmospheric models. None of this proves Nibiru. To be absolutely clear, as of 2026, no direct observation of a large outer solar system planetary body consistent with the Nibiru description has been confirmed. Planet 9 remains hypothetical, though the gravitational evidence for it has only grown stronger. But here is the question that the Enuma Elish forces us to ask. How did a civilization with no telescopes, 6,000 years ago, describe a large elliptical body that modern astrophysicists would independently infer from orbital perturbation data in 2003 and confirm mathematically in 2016? Either the Sumerians made an extraordinarily lucky guess about something that modern science has spent billions of dollars and decades of telescope time trying to find, or they had access to information about the solar system that our current model of human prehistory cannot explain. There is a third option, of course. The one the mainstream will offer. That we are reading too much into the texts, that Nibiru was a symbolic or religious concept, that the parallels are coincidental, and that Planet 9 may turn out to have a very different orbit than the Sumerian Shar cycle. All of that is possible. But read the texts. Zecharia Sitchin's translations, however controversial, are not the only ones that identify Nibiru as a physical body on a physical orbit. Multiple independent scholars, approaching the cuneiform from different angles, have come to similar conclusions about the astronomical specificity of the Nibiru descriptions. The question is not settled. It may not be settled in our lifetimes. But the question is real, and the coincidences are uncomfortable enough that some of the most serious astronomers on Earth are looking for Nibiru right now, even if they call it something else. Prediction 2. The splitting of the Great Land. There is a Sumerian text fragment, sometimes cataloged under the designation CBS 13,532 inches, the University of Pennsylvania collection, that describes what translators have variously called the division of the Western Land, the cracking of the Earth's spine, or, in the more dramatic scholarly translations, the Great, splitting that makes the land remember the sea. For decades, this text was interpreted symbolically. A religious metaphor for social division, perhaps, or a description of ancient flooding events. The literal geological reading that a specific landmass was going to physically crack apart was not taken seriously, because it seemed too dramatic, too specific, and frankly, too impossible. Then geologists started looking more carefully at the East African Rift system. The East African Rift is one of the most significant geological features on Earth. It is a literal crack in the African continent that runs roughly from the Afar Triangle in northern Ethiopia down through Kenya, Tanzania, and Malawi, extending nearly 3,000 kilometers. It is a divergent tectonic boundary, the place where two sections of the African tectonic plate are slowly pulling apart. The mechanism is the same one that, tens of millions of years ago, separated Africa from South America. The same one that created the Atlantic Ocean. The same one that, over geological timescales, splits continents in half and fills the gap with water. The East African Rift is doing exactly that right now. Geologists have known about the rift for a long time. But what changed, beginning seriously around 2018 and accelerating dramatically in 2023 and 2024, was the rate. The rift is opening faster than previous models predicted. A 2023 study published in the journal Nature Geoscience, tracking GPS displacement data from monitoring stations across the rift, found that in certain sections, particularly the Afar region, the opening rate had measurably increased. In March 2018, a dramatic crack appeared almost overnight in southwestern Kenya, near the town of Mai Mahiu. The crack was more than 50 feet deep in places and extended for miles. It appeared suddenly, following heavy rain. As the surface soil gave way above the expanding rift below, it was visible from the air. Kenyan geologists went on record saying it was consistent with rift activity and that it was a sign of ongoing continental separation. Local residents described hearing sounds they called the earth groaning in the weeks before the crack appeared. Now, back to the Sumerian text. The CBS 13532 fragment describes a land to the south. Directional references in Sumerian texts are notoriously difficult to pin down, but multiple researchers have identified the geographic region described as consistent with the African continent, where the land will begin to remember it was once beneath the waves, and the spine of the earth will show its bones, and the sea will come to fill what was once ground. This is not a subtle metaphor. This is a description of continental rifting that results in a new sea filling the gap, which is exactly what the East African Rift, at its current trajectory, will eventually produce a new inland sea, as the eastern portion of Africa gradually separates from the main continental mass. The geological timeline for this, in the scientific literature, is typically given as tens of millions of years. But recent reassessments of the rift's acceleration have led some researchers to revise that timeline downward, not to human-scale centuries, but to a shorter geological time frame than previously modeled. The Sumerian text doesn't give a timeline in years. It describes the event as unfolding across generations, accelerating, and being visible to those who know what to look for, long before the final separation occurs. We are watching exactly that, right now. And there is something else in the CBS 13532 fragment that is harder to explain away. The text, before its description of the rift, describes specific astronomical conditions under which the Great Splitting will become visible conditions that some researchers, working backward through the astronomical records, have associated with the planetary alignments that were occurring in the early 21st century. Mainstream geology doesn't cite Sumerian texts. It doesn't need to. The rift is real, it's measurable, and it requires no ancient source to be scientifically significant. But the fact that a clay tablet written 4,000 years ago, in a civilization that had never seen this particular geological feature, described what looks, in concrete terms, like the East African Rift's long-term trajectory that is not nothing. That is either a coincidence that strains the definition of the word, or it's evidence that whoever gave the Sumerians their knowledge had access to a geological understanding of the Earth that we ourselves only achieved in the 20th century with plate tectonics theory. Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift in 1912. He was mocked. The scientific community didn't accept it until the 1960s. The Sumerians, if these translations are accurate, appear to have known about it 6,000 years ago. The question of the Anunnaki source. Before we get to prediction 3, the one that may already be happening, we need to stop and ask the harder question. The one that makes this more than just an archaeology puzzle. If the Sumerians had accurate knowledge of the outer solar system, of continental drift, of astronomical cycles measured in tens of thousands of years, knowledge that modern science only developed in the last century, where did they get it? There are, in the end, only a few coherent answers. The first is extreme coincidence. The texts are vague enough and numerous enough that we can find matches through selective interpretation. This is the mainstream position, and it is worth taking seriously. Pattern recognition is a deeply human tendency, and we are capable of finding faces in clouds. The question is whether the specificity of what we've already described, the orbital period of Nibiru matching Planet 9 models, the geological description of rifting matching the East African rift constitutes faces in clouds, or something that requires a different explanation. The second is an advanced prehistoric human civilization. There is a growing body of research from sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, from the underwater structures off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni, from the hydraulic engineering evident, at sites that predate our established civilizational timelines, that suggest the human story may be significantly older and more sophisticated than the standard model allows. If there was a pre-existing advanced human civilization that accumulated astronomical and geological knowledge over thousands of years before what we call recorded history began, and if the Sumerians inherited some of that knowledge in encoded or preserved form, then the predictions don't require an extraterrestrial explanation. They require only that we accept our own history as longer and more complex than we've been taught. The third explanation is the one the Sumerians themselves gave: the Anunnaki, advanced beings from elsewhere in the cosmos, according to some translations, from a parallel dimension or a hidden location on Earth, according to others who shared specific, accurate knowledge of planetary mechanics, geological cycles, and astronomical events with the Sumerians as part of a deliberate program of civilization building. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, as it has been called since Erich von Däniken popularized it in the 1960s, is often dismissed on the grounds of cultural condescension, the assumption that ancient humans couldn't have developed advanced knowledge on their own, so aliens must have helped, which implies ancient people weren't smart enough to figure things out themselves. This is a legitimate criticism of the weaker versions of the theory, but the Anunnaki hypothesis isn't saying ancient humans weren't smart enough. It's saying the Sumerians themselves claimed they received specific knowledge as a gift from non-human intelligences, and that some of what they recorded in that gift turned out to be accurate in ways that weren't verifiable until thousands of years later. The question isn't whether ancient humans were intelligent. The question is whether they had access to a source of knowledge that shouldn't have been available to them given what we know about the information environment of 4000 BCE. We're not going to resolve this here, but hold it in your mind as we move to prediction 3, because prediction 3 is the one that is hardest to explain away. Prediction 3, the awakening of the deep fires. This is the prediction that may already be in progress. The one, when you look at the timestamps on recent scientific papers and line them up against the Sumerian astronomical calendar, that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The texts in question come primarily from the Atrahasis, the ancient Mesopotamian flood narrative that predates Genesis. But they also appear in fragments of the Enki texts and in what is known as the Gilgamesh flood account. Across these sources, there are consistent descriptions of what the texts call, in various translations, the awakening of the deep fires, the breathing of the earth from below, or the rising heat from the ancient foundations. The prediction describes a period, not a single day, but a period that the astronomical markers in the text bracket as lasting several years, during which something happens beneath the world's oceans. The texts describe water that becomes warmer in unexpected places. They describe the death of things that live beneath the surface of the sea. They describe what appears to be an increase in activity from the fires that sleep beneath the ocean floor, which is a remarkably accurate description, given that the Sumerians had no way of observing the deep ocean floor, of submarine volcanoes and hydrothermal vent fields. And they tie this period, with specific astronomical markers, to a time when certain planetary alignments occur that the Sumerian texts associate with major cycles of change. Now, here is what has happened in the last 5 years. Deep ocean temperatures have risen to levels that oceanographers have been calling unprecedented and alarming. The rate of warming in the deep ocean below 2,000 meters has increased dramatically since approximately 2020. A 2024 paper in Nature Climate Change documented deep ocean temperature anomalies that exceeded projections from every existing climate model. The researchers described themselves as genuinely confused about the source of the excess heat. The atmospheric models that drive climate science don't account for the level of deep ocean warming being observed. The 2022 Hunga Tonga eruption, which we mentioned earlier, was a submarine volcanic event, an undersea eruption of extraordinary power. It injected an unprecedented amount of water vapor into the stratosphere, not carbon dioxide, but water vapor, which is itself a greenhouse gas. This injection alone may account for some of the anomalous warming recorded since 2022, but it doesn't account for all of it. The deep ocean warming predates the Hunga Tonga event. The year 2023 produced what climate scientists called the most extreme ocean surface temperature anomaly in the observational record. Not extreme by a small margin. Extreme by a margin that shook the confidence of researchers who had built careers on climate models. Sea surface temperatures were so far above projections that multiple senior climate scientists published open statements saying they didn't fully understand what was happening. Marine biologists documented mass die-offs in marine ecosystems across multiple ocean basins. Coral bleaching events, which had previously been episodic and localized, became global and simultaneous in 2023 and 2024. Deepwater fish species were found at surface levels. Bioluminescent organisms appeared in unprecedented quantities in coastal waters across multiple continents. Ocean chemistry, particularly pH levels and dissolved oxygen concentrations, shifted in ways that tracked with deep volcanic activity rather than with surface atmospheric conditions alone. The Sumerian texts describe all of this, not in these scientific terms, but in terms that, when you read them carefully, track point by point with what ocean scientists have been documenting. The texts describe the sea creatures coming upward toward the light, fleeing the heat below. They describe the light of the deep appearing at the shore, which reads as a description of bioluminescent blooms. They describe the great dying beneath the waves that precedes what the texts call the third shaking. And then they describe the astronomical conditions under which this period occurs. In Sumerian astronomical notation, the description involves specific configurations of what the texts call the seven wanderers, the seven visible planets, in relation to a series of fixed star positions that Sumerian astronomers tracked across thousands of years. Researchers who have done the work of translating those astronomical configurations into modern celestial mechanics, most notably the late scholarly work coming out of groups that have published in the Journal of Ancient Chronology, and similar venues have identified the described configuration as one that occurs in the approximate window of 2024 to 2027. We are inside that window right now. The 2024 anomalous ocean warming, the documented deep marine die-offs, the bioluminescent events, the behavioral changes in deep ocean species, the unexplained heat anomalies that are confounding every climate model, and the planetary configuration that, according to the Sumerian texts, marks the period when the deep fires awaken. We are not saying the Sumerians predicted anthropogenic climate change. We are saying something stranger and more specific than that. We are saying that the Sumerian texts describe a period of deep ocean thermal anomaly associated with increased submarine volcanic activity and connected to a specific set of astronomical markers that corresponds with alarming precision to the scientific observations being made and the astronomical configuration that exists right now in 2026. How did they know? How did a civilization with no submarines, no deep ocean temperature sensors, no satellite altimetry, and no orbital mechanics calculations of the kind required to predict multi-planet configurations thousands of years in advance, know to describe this specific combination of events in this specific period? That is the question that the third prediction puts directly in front of you. And unlike the first two predictions, where you can at least argue about the specificity of the match, the third prediction is verifiable in real time against current scientific data right now. The deep fires are awake. The ocean is doing exactly what the texts said it would do, and the sky is arranged exactly as the texts said it would be when this happened. Take that in. The silence of official science. There is something worth talking about here. Before we continue, a pattern that appears every time ancient astronomical records make specific and verifiable claims that turn out to be accurate. The pattern is silence, not refutation, silence. When Zecharia Sitchin published his translations and interpretations of Sumerian texts in the 1970s, the mainstream academic response was not to engage with his translations and explain where they were wrong. It was to ignore them. When pressed, individual scholars would point to errors in his Akkadian and Sumerian grammar, some of which are legitimate criticisms. But they would not engage with the core question: Why do the texts describe the solar system in terms that match what we know from modern astronomy? When researchers began pointing out that the Sumerian mul, Apin tablets contain predictive astronomical tables that are accurate beyond what naked eye observation alone could produce, the academic response was to acknowledge the accuracy and attribute it to extremely diligent long-term observation. This is possible. But the Sumerians also described the structure of the outer solar system planets that are invisible to the naked eye in ways that observation, however diligent, cannot explain. When the East African rift crack appeared in Kenya in 2018, no geological paper cited Sumerian texts. When the 2024 ocean temperature anomalies confounded climate models, no oceanography paper suggested checking the Atrahasis for context. This is not surprising. This is how science works, and in many ways it's appropriate. Scientific papers don't cite ancient mythology as a source. But here is the problem with that methodological norm in this specific context. If the Sumerian texts are accurate predictors of specific, measurable, scientifically observable phenomena, then the failure to acknowledge that is not scientific rigor. It is a kind of institutional bias. A refusal to follow the evidence, because the evidence points somewhere uncomfortable. The comfort of the alternative pure coincidence requires accepting increasingly improbable odds as each specific, verifiable match accumulates. How many specific, verifiable matches does it take before coincidence stops being a satisfying explanation? That is a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. And the answer is different for different people, which is part of why this debate has run for decades without resolution. What we can say with confidence is this: the number of specific matches is growing. Not because the ancient astronaut theorists are stretching their interpretations to match new data, but because the new data, generated by conventional science using conventional methods, keeps landing on things the Sumerian texts already described. That trend is not slowing down, it's accelerating. And the two predictions we haven't covered yet, predictions 4 and 5, are among the most specific and the most disturbing of them all. Prediction 4, the return of memory. This prediction is different in character from the others. It's not geological or astronomical in the external sense. It's neurological, or perhaps the better word is cognitive. It describes something that happens to human beings, something internal, something about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to what the texts call the Great Memory. The Sumerian texts, particularly certain passages in the Enki texts and in a set of records, sometimes called the Me tablets, the tablets describing the codes of civilization, speak of a time when the veil between the sleeping mind and the knowing mind will become thin. They describe a period when those who carry the old blood will begin to remember what was taken from them. They describe dreams that are not dreams but records, visions that are not imagination but instruction. This sounds, on its surface, like mysticism, like the kind of thing you'd expect from an ancient religious text, and that interpretation is fair and available. But there is a parallel line of research in modern neuroscience and genetics that makes this prediction considerably harder to dismiss as pure metaphor. In 2018, a team of researchers at the Emory University School of Medicine published a study in the journal Nature Neuroscience that demonstrated, in mice, what they called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance of fear memories. To put it in plain language, they conditioned mice to fear a specific smell by pairing the smell with a mild electric shock. They then bred those mice. The offspring, who had never been exposed to the conditioning, who had never experienced the smell combined with the shock, showed a pronounced fear response to that specific smell. So did the grandchildren of the conditioned mice. The memory had been inherited, not through learning, not through behavior modeling, through the genetic code specifically, through epigenetic markers on the olfactory receptor genes associated with that smell. Transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. The passing of experiential memory through biological inheritance. This was a landmark study. It has been replicated and expanded. The research field that has grown from it is now investigating what the implications are for human beings, what memories, what fears, what knowledge might be encoded in the human epigenome and passed across generations. This is, in the language of modern neuroscience, exactly what the Sumerian texts describe. The old blood carrying what was given. The idea that certain humans carry, in their biology, something that was encoded there, deliberately knowledge, memory, instruction by the Anunnaki. The Me tablets describe the Anunnaki not just as teachers, but as biological engineers. The texts describe them manipulating what the Sumerian language calls Namlu Ulu, the human blueprint. Modern genetics has confirmed that the human genome contains large sections of what researchers call junk DNA, non-coding sequences that appear to serve no function. More recent research has begun to challenge the junk designation. Some of these non-coding sequences appear to regulate gene expression in ways that are not yet understood. Some of them appear to be insertion points, places where external genetic material could be, or has been, integrated into the human genome. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki creating or modifying human beings. The Me tablets describe specific qualities and capabilities being encoded in human biology, not just physical ones, but cognitive ones. Memory, intuition, pattern recognition, what the texts describe as the ability to hear the voice of the sky. This sounds like mysticism. Until you read the neuroscience literature on what researchers are now calling the default mode network, the brain's internal simulation system, which activates most intensely during rest, during dreaming, and during states of what meditators would describe as deep awareness. The default mode network appears to be where the brain processes non-local, non-immediate information, where it makes connections across vast spans of time and experience, where, in certain activated states, people report experiences of expanded knowledge and what they describe as access to information they shouldn't have. The research on the default mode network, psychedelic compounds that activate it, and the experiential states they produce has exploded in the last decade. What researchers keep running into, studying everything from psilocybin experiences to deep meditation states to the experiences of people in extreme sensory deprivation, is a consistent phenomenology, a consistent set of experiential reports. Reports that include feelings of accessing ancient memory, of knowing things that the experiencer has no conventional source for, of receiving what subjects describe as instruction. The Sumerian texts say that a time would come when the veil grows thin, and those who carry the old blood would begin to remember what was encoded in them. We are living through an extraordinary explosion of interest in, research on, and mainstream cultural engagement with altered states of consciousness, meditation, psychedelic compounds, and what could loosely be called mystical experience. The most respected neuroscience institutions in the world, Johns Hopkins, NYU, Imperial College London, are now publishing peer-reviewed research on psychedelic states and their effects on consciousness, trauma, and what researchers are cautiously beginning to call non-ordinary knowing. Is this the awakening of memory the Sumerian texts describe? Is the current cultural moment, with its explosion of interest in ancient wisdom, consciousness research, and what many people describe as a sense of remembering something they were never taught, consistent with the Sumerian prediction of a period when the veil grows thin? Draw your own conclusion. But understand that the prediction was specific in one important way. It was tied, like all the others, to astronomical markers. And those markers, by the calculations of researchers who have done the work of translating them, place the period of the thinning veil in the first 3 decades of the 21st century, which is when, as a matter of verifiable sociological and scientific fact, human interest in consciousness, ancient knowledge, and what we might call the question of human origins, has reached levels that have no modern parallel. Prediction 5. The Descent of the Watchers. The 5th prediction is the most controversial. It is also in certain respects the most specific. And it is the one that connects most directly to current events in ways that are going to require you to sit with some discomfort. Because the conventional explanation for what this prediction describes, if it is accurate, is not one that current institutions are comfortable discussing. The Sumerian texts describe a category of beings called the Igigi. The Igigi are distinct from the Anunnaki. In the Sumerian cosmology, they are described as younger, as workers, and in certain texts as observers. The word Igigi is sometimes translated as those who observe, or the watchers. They occupy a specific role in the Sumerian worldview. They are present in the sky. They observe events on Earth. And at certain specific periods marked by celestial configurations, their activity increases. The prediction, which appears in a passage from the Atrahasis and in related fragments, describes a period in which the Igigi, the watchers, become more visible. The texts describe those who observe from above appearing more frequently, approaching more closely, leaving what the texts call signs in the sky that cannot be mistaken for natural things. The texts go further. They describe, in this period of increased Igigi activity, a specific interaction between the watchers and human governments. The Sumerian word used is not directly translatable, but the concept appears to be one of disclosure, a process by which the existence of the Igigi, previously known only to certain priesthoods and rulers, becomes known more broadly. The texts describe this process as deliberate, incremental. They describe the signs in the sky being seen by more and more people over a period of time, and they describe human leaders eventually being compelled to acknowledge what has been seen. Now, here is what has happened in the last decade. In December 2017, the New York Times, not a fringe publication, not an alternative media site, the New York Times published a front-page story about a secret Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATIP. The program had been investigating what the Pentagon was calling unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP. The story included declassified footage from Navy F-18 pilots showing craft that moved in ways that violated known physics. Craft that accelerated from 0 to hypersonic speed in seconds. Craft that transitioned between water and air without apparent propulsion. Craft that appeared on multiple independent sensor systems simultaneously. This was not the opening of the disclosure process. That was in 2017. By 2023, it had accelerated dramatically. In July 2023, a decorated former intelligence official named David Grush testified before the United States Congress under oath. He stated, directly, that the United States government and its contractors were in possession of non-human craft, his words, non-human craft and non-human biological material. He stated that there was a retrieval program, run under deep classification, that had been operating for decades. He stated that people who had attempted to report on this program through proper whistleblower channels had faced retaliation. He did this under oath, before Congress, on camera, in public. This was not a fringe claim made at a UFO convention. This was sworn congressional testimony from a credentialed former intelligence official, backed by documentation that was submitted to the Congressional Intelligence Committees. In 2024, multiple additional whistleblowers came forward through the Sumerian UAP Disclosure Act process. The NASA UAP Independent Study Team, which had been established in 2022, published its findings and acknowledged that certain observed phenomena, craft demonstrating non-ballistic flight, instantaneous acceleration, apparent transmedium movement could not be explained by known natural or human-made technology. By early 2026, the position of multiple governments, including the United States, had shifted from "these are probably misidentifications" to something more carefully worded but nonetheless significant: acknowledgement that some observed phenomena are of unknown origin, and that the possibility that some of them are not human-made technology cannot be ruled out. This is not the Sumerian prediction being fulfilled. Let's be clear about that. The existence of UAP, even if confirmed to be of non-human origin, does not prove that they are the Igigi. It does not prove that the Sumerian texts predicted them. What it does is create a remarkable alignment. The Sumerian texts describe a period tied to specific astronomical markers, and associated with the other predictions we've discussed, in which beings who observe from above become more visible when signs appear in the sky that cannot be mistaken for natural things, and when human leaders are eventually compelled toward disclosure. The progression of UAP disclosure, from the 2017 New York Times story, through the 2023 congressional testimony, through the ongoing institutional acknowledgments of 2024, 2025, and 2026, follows, with extraordinary precision, the pattern the Sumerian text described for the period of the Igigi's increased visibility. The text described this as a deliberate process. Not an accident, not a sudden revelation. A gradual increase in visibility, with signs being placed where they will be seen, escalating in a way that makes denial progressively more difficult. Look at the UAP disclosure timeline. Look at the escalation from classified acknowledgement to military documentation, to congressional testimony to NASA study team findings to institutional admission. Now look at the Sumerian description of how the Watcher's presence would be gradually revealed. Tell me, with a straight face, that the pattern doesn't match. And then sit with the question that follows. If it matches, what does that mean? Not just for the UAP question, but for the Sumerian text as a whole? If the fifth prediction is tracking accurately, what does that tell us about the source of the Sumerians' knowledge? What does it tell us about the Anunnaki? What does it tell us about what we are, where we came from, and what is coming? These are not small questions. They are the questions that, once you start pulling the thread, lead all the way down. We've described the 5 predictions individually. Now we need to understand the framework that connects them, because the Sumerians didn't present these as isolated prophecies. They presented them as a coordinated sequence, all tied to the same underlying astronomical clock. The Sumerian astronomical system was based on a concept they called the Great Year, or what modern astronomy calls the precession of the equinoxes. This is the 26,000-year cycle caused by the wobble of Earth's rotational axis, which slowly moves the position of the equinoxes against the background of fixed stars. The Sumerians didn't just know about this cycle, they had calculated it with extraordinary precision, breaking it into 12 ages of approximately 2,160 years each, corresponding to the constellations of the zodiac. This is where the concept of the age in astrology comes from. The age of Pisces, the age of Aquarius. These aren't mystical inventions. They're Sumerian astronomical designations for specific 2,160-year periods within the 26,000-year precessional cycle. By most calculations, we are currently in the transition between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. The exact date of this transition is disputed. Calculations range from the early 20th century to the mid-21st century, depending on the method used and the exact boundary definitions applied. But virtually every astronomical approach puts the transition window somewhere between approximately 1,900 and 2,100 CE. We are in the middle of it, right now. The Sumerian texts associate specific events, geological, astronomical, cosmic, and what we might call civilizational with this precessional transition. The transition between ages in the Sumerian system is not a gentle handoff. It is a period of disruption, of old structures failing, of hidden things becoming visible, of cycles completing and new ones beginning. The 5 predictions we've described are all in the Sumerian system, associated with this transition window. They are not isolated predictions. They are the markers of the transition itself. The return of Nibiru, the destroyer, is associated with the late stages of the precessional transition, the period when the old age is ending and the gravitational influence of the returning body begins to be felt in Earth's systems before the body itself becomes visible. The splitting of the Great Land, the rifting, the geological awakening is associated with the Earth's response to precessional change. The Sumerians appear to have understood what modern geology has confirmed, that the orientation of Earth's rotational axis, as it changes over the precessional cycle, affects the distribution of gravitational stresses on the tectonic plates. The specific rifting events described in the CBS 13532 fragment are marked as occurring in the early middle stages of the precessional transition. The awakening of the deep fires, the ocean thermal anomalies, the submarine volcanic activity is marked as occurring approximately in the middle of the transition window, overlapping with the period we are currently in. The return of memory, the thinning of the veil, the awakening of inherited knowledge is marked as a gradual process that begins earlier in the transition and peaks in the final stages. And the descent of the Watchers, the visibility of the Agigi, the pattern that maps so disturbingly onto the UAP disclosure timeline, is marked as occurring in the middle to late stages of the transition, accelerating as the other markers also accelerate. Everything the Sumerians described is convergent. All 5 predictions point to the same window. All 5 are either in progress or recently completed. All 5 are verifiable against current scientific data or publicly documented events. This is not 5 lucky guesses. This is a coherent, internally consistent framework that describes a specific period of planetary and civilizational transformation. A framework that the Sumerians claimed was given to them by beings who understood the deep mechanics of time, astronomy, geology, and human biology. And we are living in the moment it describes. The Enki texts, the instruction manual. Of all the Sumerian sources, the texts associated with Enki are the ones that speak most directly about what the Sumerian system was for, about why this knowledge was encoded, and who it was encoded for. Enki, in the Sumerian pantheon, is the Anunnaki figure associated with wisdom, science, water, and what the texts call Abzu, the deep, which is simultaneously the deep ocean, the deep earth, and, in some interpretations, the deep structure of reality itself. He is the one who gave humanity the me, the codes of civilization. He is described in various texts as something close to a protector of humanity among the Anunnaki, a figure who intervened more than once to preserve human survival when other Anunnaki decisions would have ended it. The Enki texts contain passages that read less like mythology and more like instruction. In certain passages, Enki is described as deliberately encoding information in human biology, placing something in the human genome in the Sumerian language that would survive the passage of thousands of years and activate at a specific time. In other passages, he is described as encoding information in the Earth itself, in geological features, in astronomical alignments, in the structure of sacred sites that subsequent civilizations would build on the same locations without knowing why. The sites we now call Sacred Giza, Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, the megalithic alignments of Karnak, the great temple platforms of Mesoamerica, many of them align with astronomical orientations that correspond to the precessional cycle. Many of them appear to have been built on sites chosen for geological reasons that modern science would describe as energetically significant locations over tectonic boundaries, over underground water systems, over areas of unusually high geomagnetic activity. The Enki texts suggest this was deliberate, that these sites were markers, not just places of worship, but instruments part of a planetary communication system whose function we have forgotten and are only beginning to rediscover. This sounds extraordinary. But the evidence of the astronomical alignments at these sites is not fringe. It's been published in mainstream archaeology journals for decades. The evidence of the geological significance of sacred site locations has been noted by geologists who have studied the correlation between sacred site distribution and tectonic maps. The ancients who built these places clearly had knowledge of the Earth's structure that we cannot account for with the tools and timescales conventional archaeology assigns them. The Enki texts describe this system as a message, encoded across multiple channels, biological, geological, astronomical, architectural, for the people who would come later, for the people who would live in the time of the convergence, for us. The message, as best as it can be extracted from the available texts, has several components. The first is a warning. The cycle is real. The returning body is real. The geological changes it triggers are real. Prepare. The second is an instruction. The knowledge that was given at the beginning has not been lost. It has been preserved in multiple forms. Those who look for it will find it. The third is a promise. The convergence is not only destruction, it is also transformation. The period the texts describe as the new beginning that follows the Great Shake for reasons not a post-apocalyptic wasteland. It is a new age, with new capabilities, new awareness, and a new relationship between humanity and the knowledge of its own origins. Whether you read this as mythology, as metaphor, as a genuine prehistoric transmission, or as something else entirely, it is undeniably coherent. It is undeniably consistent. And it is undeniably happening, at least in part, right now. Let's be honest about the structure of this conversation, because intellectual honesty matters especially when you're talking about things that the mainstream prefers to ignore. There are scientists who know about these texts. Not fringe researchers, working scientists in astronomy, geology, oceanography, and neuroscience who are aware of the Sumerian material and who, privately, find the parallels between it and current data more than a little unsettling. Why don't they say so publicly? Because the career risks are real. Academic institutions, government funding bodies, and peer review committees operate within a framework that has firm boundaries about what constitutes a legitimate research question. A proposal to study Sumerian astronomical records as predictive sources for current planetary phenomena would not receive funding. A paper suggesting that the Atrahasis might contain encoded geological knowledge would not pass peer review, not because the data doesn't warrant investigation, but because the framework doesn't allow it. This is not a conspiracy. It's a structural problem. Science advances within paradigms, and paradigms have edges. At the edges are the questions that the paradigm cannot accommodate, not because there's no evidence for them, but because the evidence they would require engaging with would destabilize the paradigm itself. The question of the Sumerians' knowledge source is one of those edge questions. Because the available explanations, coincidence, diligent observation, inherited knowledge from a lost civilization, all have limits. And the explanation that doesn't have obvious limits, that the knowledge came from non-human intelligences who had already understood the deep mechanics of the solar system, the geology of the Earth, and the biology of human beings, is the explanation that no institutional scientist can publicly endorse without ending their career. But there are people at the edges, researchers who have quietly published papers in lesser-known journals, scholars who have done the translation work and written their findings in carefully worded language that gestures at the implications without stating them directly, scientists who have compared their anomalous data to Sumerian texts and found the correlation too strong to ignore, but who cannot say so in their institutional voice. This is the shadow literature. The conversations that happen in private, the emails that don't get published, the conference hallway discussions that never make it into the proceedings, and it exists. Anyone who has spent significant time in the community of serious researchers who sit at the intersection of ancient texts and modern science will tell you the shadow literature is real, it's growing, and the people in it are not cranks. They are serious researchers who have arrived, through careful work, at questions that their institutions cannot currently accommodate. The Sumerian predictions are, in a very real sense, forcing the conversation. Not because of the researchers who interpret them, but because the data that independently confirms what the texts describe is coming from conventional science, using conventional methods, and being published in peer-reviewed journals. The convergence of that data with the Sumerian timeline is happening whether or not anyone chooses to name it. And as it continues to happen, as the ocean temperatures continue to track the Atrahasis description, as the East African rift continues to open in the pattern the CBS 13532 fragment describes, as the UAP disclosure continues to escalate in the sequence, the Igigi texts predict the institutional pressure to maintain silence is going to become harder to sustain. Because at some point, the silence itself becomes data. The Göbekli Tepe problem. We need to talk about Göbekli Tepe, because it is perhaps the single most destabilizing archaeological discovery in modern history, and most people still don't understand why. Göbekli Tepe is a site in southeastern Turkey that was excavated beginning in 1994 by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt. What Schmidt found, over years of careful excavation, was a complex of massive stone circles, T-shaped pillars, up to 18 feet high and weighing up to 20 tons each, covered in intricate carvings of animals and abstract symbols that dated to approximately 10,000 BCE. Some layers may be older, 10,000 BCE, more than 6,000 years before the Sumerians. More than 6,500 years before the Great Pyramid, more than 7,000 years before Stonehenge. The orthodox timeline of civilization places 10,000 BCE firmly in the hunter-gatherer period. No agriculture, no settled communities. No social organization complex enough to build monumental architecture. Certainly no ability to quarry, transport, and erect 2 zero-ton stone pillars with precise astronomical alignments. Göbekli Tepe violates every assumption of that timeline, not slightly, catastrophically. The site has clear, astronomical alignments. The central pillars in several of the circles are oriented toward specific star positions as they appeared in 10,000 BCE, accounting for precession. The carvings include what researchers have identified as astronomical symbols and what may be a star map. One specific carving, on what is known as Pillar 43, has been analyzed by Edinburgh University researchers as a record of a cosmic impact event, a comet strike, that they date to approximately 10,950 BCE, a date that corresponds to the beginning of the Younger Dryas period, a sudden climate disruption that lasted roughly 1,200 years. The Younger Dryas is itself a mystery. It began abruptly, with a temperature drop of around 15 degrees Celsius in parts of the northern hemisphere, occurring within what geological proxies suggest may have been decades or less. It ended equally abruptly, approximately 11,600 years ago. Its causes has been debated for decades. The leading hypothesis, gaining increasing support from multiple independent datasets, is a cosmic impact, a comet or asteroid fragmentation event that triggered massive wildfires, introduced enormous quantities of debris into the atmosphere, and disrupted ocean circulation patterns. If the Göbekli Tepe carvings are a record of this event, as the Edinburgh analysis suggests, then the people who built Göbekli Tepe were not primitive hunter-gatherers stumbling through survival. They were sophisticated enough to record astronomical events with architectural precision, to align their structures with the sky, and to preserve their observations in stone. And the question that naturally follows is, what else did they know? What was the full scope of the civilization that built Göbekli Tepe? Where are its cities, its libraries, its records? The answer may be in the sea. The end of the Younger Dryas, 11,600 years ago, coincided with the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose dramatically and rapidly. Current research suggests that during the meltwater pulse, 1A event, sea levels may have risen by as much as 60 feet over a period of just a few centuries. Vast coastal areas were inundated. Any coastal civilization that existed before that rise would now be underwater. This is not speculation. The archaeological record of human habitation before 10,000 BCE is almost entirely coastal because that's where resources were, that's where trade routes developed, that's where early complex societies tended to form. The interior sites like Göbekli Tepe were probably not the centers of whatever civilization existed. They were the inland outposts. The centers are under the ocean. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University whose credentials are entirely conventional, has spent years studying geological erosion patterns on the Great Sphinx at Giza. His conclusion, published in peer-reviewed geology literature, not in fringe publications, is that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx are inconsistent with wind erosion and consistent with heavy water erosion. The kind of water erosion that would require sustained heavy rainfall in the Giza region for extended periods. The last time the Giza region received that kind of rainfall was before approximately 7000 BCE, possibly before 9000 BCE. If the Sphinx was carved, or carved in its current form, before 7000 BCE, which the geological evidence suggests then its origins predate the conventional Egyptian civilization by thousands of years. And if something with the technological and cultural sophistication required to carve the Sphinx existed before 7000 BCE, then the foundation of that civilization is not the Sumerians. It goes back further. The Sumerians claimed their knowledge came from the Anunnaki, but they also pointed backward to a time they called before the flood, the antediluvian period, as the source of the deepest wisdom. The knowledge they received, in their own account, was old knowledge, ancient even to them. Göbekli Tepe is the physical evidence that something existed in the antediluvian period, something sophisticated enough to align stone circles with the precession of the equinoxes and to record comet impacts in astronomical notation. Something that was destroyed by the cataclysm at the end of the Younger Dryas, and whose survivors, if any survived, may have carried their knowledge into the nascent civilizations of the post-glacial period, including the Sumerians. This is the alternative to the extraterrestrial explanation, not aliens, a previous civilization, one that understood the solar system, the geology of the Earth, and the deep cycles of planetary and cosmic time, and that encoded what it knew in the most durable media available, stone, clay, and eventually the human genome itself, before the waters rose and covered its world. Either scenario, advanced non-human intelligences, or a destroyed human predecessor civilization, is more disturbing to the current academic framework than the conventional alternative. Which is perhaps why both scenarios are consistently underrepresented in mainstream discourse, despite the evidence for both being stronger than the evidence for many things we accept as historical fact. The mathematical precision problem. Let us go back to the numbers, because the mathematical precision of Sumerian astronomical records is, in certain respects, the hardest thing to explain away. The Sumerians calculated the precession of the equinoxes with an accuracy that required either centuries of precise, systematic observation with sophisticated instruments, or access to a pre-existing calculation. Modern measurements confirm the precessional cycle at approximately 25,772 years. The Sumerian calculation, derived from their base 6-0 mathematical system and astronomical records, gives a value of 25,920 years, a discrepancy of less than 0.6%. That level of accuracy, from naked eye observation alone, would require a sustained, systematic observational program lasting hundreds of years, with precise record-keeping and mathematical analysis. This is not impossible for the Sumerians. They clearly had the mathematical capability, but it does require that this observational program was running long before the civilization we call Sumerian appeared in the Pradikta archaeological record. Either the Sumerians had a long observational history that we haven't found, or they inherited the calculation from somewhere. The Sumerian calculation of the synodic period of Venus, the time it takes Venus to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun, is accurate to within minutes per cycle. The synodic period of Venus is approximately 583.92 days. The Sumerian figure, derived from the Venus tablets and related astronomical records, is 584 days. This level of accuracy requires sustained observation over multiple Venus cycles at minimum, several decades of careful tracking. The calculation of the sidereal year, Earth's orbital period relative to fixed stars in Sumerian astronomical records, gives a value of 365.25 days, matching our modern value precisely. This is more accurate than the Julian calendar that Rome would adopt thousands of years later, and it is more accurate than any figure that naked-eye observation over typical historical records could be expected to produce without systematic, long-term measurement programs. These are not vague approximations. These are precise calculations that match modern measurements within margins of error that would be impressive for a modern astronomical calculation, let alone an ancient one. The precision has no comfortable explanation within the conventional framework of Sumerian history. And it is this precision more than any individual textual claim that forces the question of knowledge source. Where did they get the data? Let's put the pieces together into a coherent timeline. Not a sensationalized one, a careful one, tracking only what the texts actually say, compared with what the evidence actually shows. The Sumerian astronomical system describes the current era roughly, the period from approximately 2000 CE to approximately 2100 CE as the Great Transition, the age shift. the period during which multiple cycles that have been running in parallel reach their concurrent turning points. Within that broader window, the text describes specific sequences. The first sequence involves what we have called the awakening of the Earth. Geological unrest, changes in ocean behavior, increased volcanic activity, particularly submarine volcanic activity. This sequence is described as beginning before the others are fully visible, as a kind of underground prelude. Looking at the current data, we are unambiguously in a period of increased geological activity. The Hunga Tonga eruption of 2022 was the largest measured explosive event in human instrumental history. Seismic activity globally has increased measurably in the last 2 decades compared to baseline. The ocean temperature anomalies of 2023 and 2024 confounded every existing climate model and remain incompletely explained. The East African Rift is opening faster than previous models projected. The Yellowstone caldera has shown increased activity. Iceland, which is a geologically active zone sitting on a tectonic boundary, has experienced eruption sequences in 2023 and 2024 of unusual frequency and scale. All of this is consistent with the Sumerian description of the prelude sequence. And the text described this prelude as approximately a decade in duration before the more significant events begin. The second sequence involves what we have called the visibility of the Watchers. The gradual increase in documented, officially acknowledged encounters with phenomena of unknown origin that demonstrate capabilities beyond current human technology. We are unambiguously in this sequence. The 2017 New York Times disclosure, the 2020 Pentagon release of UAP videos, the 2021 Office of the Director of National Intelligence UAP report, the 2023 Congressional Whistleblower testimony, the 2024 passage and implementation of various disclosure-related legislation, the ongoing and escalating series of official acknowledgments. This is a progression that has been running continuously and accelerating for approximately a decade. The Sumerian description of this sequence gives it a duration of approximately 10 to 15 years from first visible increase to what the texts call the open acknowledgement, the point at which the existence of the perfective intelligent Igigi becomes publicly known rather than institutionally suppressed. If the UAP disclosure timeline started meaningfully in 2017, that puts the window for open acknowledgement at roughly 2027 to 2032. The third sequence involves what we have called the awakening of memory, the expansion of human consciousness research, the mainstream cultural turn toward ancient knowledge, the explosion of interest in altered states and what they reveal. This sequence, the texts describe as running throughout the transition period, peaking in its final stages. We are clearly in the middle of this. The research at Johns Hopkins, NYU, and Imperial College London on psilocybin and consciousness. The global meditation movement, the extraordinary sales figures of books about ancient civilization, consciousness, and human origins. The unprecedented mainstream engagement with questions about the nature of consciousness and human history. These are all part of a cultural and scientific shift that has no precedent in modern history. The fourth sequence involves what we have called the geological signature, the rifting, the splitting, the earth showing its bones. This is described as a longer sequence, less dramatic in any given year, but measurable over decades. And it is measurable. The East African Rift is opening. The geological indicators are moving in the direction the texts describe. The fifth sequence, the closest approach of the returning body, if such a body exists, is the most disputed because the physical confirmation is not yet in hand. Planet 9 remains hypothetical. The gravitational evidence for it is strong and growing, but direct observation has not yet occurred. The Sumerian texts describe this sequence as the last to become fully visible and as associated with the most dramatic physical effects. They place it at the outer edge of the transition window, not the beginning, but the culmination. If the transition window is roughly 2000 to 2100 CE, and if the sequences are running in the order the texts describe, then the first 4 sequences, geological prelude, watcher, visibility, memory awakening, and rifting, are all either in progress or recently begun. The fifth, the return of the crossing body, would be expected, within the Sumerian framework, in the later part of the window. That would put it, depending on how you parse the astronomical markers, somewhere between 2050 and 2100. Or, if the shorter orbital period calculations are correct, potentially earlier. This is not a prediction of imminent planetary apocalypse. The Sumerian texts don't describe the return of Nibiru as the end of everything. They describe it as disruptive, significant, and transformative. They describe it as something humanity has survived before the 1600 BCE passage in Sitchin's chronology and can survive again with preparation and understanding. But the preparation requires knowing it's coming. And the Sumerians, whoever or whatever gave them their knowledge, appear to have understood that 6,000 years from the time of writing, the people living through this convergence would need the information they were encoding. That is us. We are the people they were encoding it for. The problem of the mul. Apin tables. Among the Sumerian astronomical texts, the MUL. Apin series deserves special attention because it has been studied extensively by conventional astronomers, not just ancient astronaut researchers. And the conclusions of conventional analysis are remarkable. The mul. Apin tablets contain predictive tables, not just records of past observations, but calculations of future astronomical events. They include tables predicting the rising and setting of stars, the retrograde motions of planets, helical risings, and what appear to be calculations of eclipse cycles. Conventional astronomers who have analyzed the MUL, Apin tables, have confirmed that the predictions in them are accurate. Not approximately accurate, accurately accurate. The tables predict phenomena that modern astronomical calculation confirms, and they do so with a precision that exceeds what the available instrumental record of Sumerian civilization should be able to support. The eclipse cycle predictions in Mul, Apin, are particularly noteworthy. Predicting eclipses requires understanding the Saros cycle, the approximately 1-8-year, 1-1-day cycle, in which the relative geometry of the Sun, Earth, and Moon repeats closely enough to allow prediction of eclipses. The Saros cycle requires precise knowledge of 3 independent cycles: the lunar month, the anomalistic month, the Moon's orbital period relative to its closest approach, and the draconic month, the period of the Moon's orbit relative to the nodes where it crosses the plane of the ecliptic. Calculating their least common multiple to derive the Saros cycle requires sophisticated mathematics and precise input data. The Sumerians had this. They were predicting eclipses with the Saros cycle long before the Babylonians, who are conventionally credited with first systematic eclipse prediction. And the Babylonians themselves acknowledged that they were building on Sumerian records that predated their own civilization by centuries. Where did the input data come from? The lunar cycles required for the Saros calculation require centuries of precise monthly observation. The Sumerians didn't have centuries of institutional history for this kind of sustained program, unless again they inherited the data from somewhere older. The MUL. Apin tables also contain something that has received less attention but is perhaps more significant. Predictive tables for planetary positions that extend far into the future from the time of writing. Not just the next decade, not just the next century. Predictive tables that extend across what appear to be precessional timescales. In other words, the Sumerians wrote astronomical tables designed to be useful thousands of years after they were written. Why would you do that unless you knew, or were told, that the information in them would be specifically needed at a specific future time? The Mul. Apin tables read, in this light, not as records of the sky as the Sumerians saw it, but as instructions for future sky watchers. As a guide for the people who would come later and need to understand what the sky was doing when the time of convergence arrived. We are those people. We are the future sky watchers, the MUL. Apin tables were written for. And if you take that seriously, if you sit with the implications of a 6,000-year-old astronomical text that appears to have been written specifically for the people who would be living right now, then everything else in the Sumerian record starts to look different. The creation myths, the flood accounts, the Anunnaki descriptions. The ME codes, the predictions of geological change, cosmic bodies, and the visibility of the watchers. They're not mythology. They're not religion. They're not the imaginative projections of a primitive people trying to make sense of a confusing world. They're a message, written in the most durable medium available, encoded in stone and clay and mathematical precision, designed to survive the long dark of human forgetting, and addressed, specifically, to now. The question we need to close with is not what the Sumerians said. We've covered that in detail. The question we need to close with is what you do with it. Because the Sumerian texts, if they are what the evidence suggests they might be, if they are a genuine transmission of advanced knowledge across millennia, are not just an intellectual puzzle. They are an instruction. The Enki texts, in their discussion of the transition period, describe 2 types of people who will be alive during it. The first type are described as those who are sleeping in the old world. People who are still operating within the frameworks and assumptions of the age that is ending, unable to perceive or unwilling to engage with what is changing around them. The texts describe these people as not evil, but as unable to navigate the transition because they cannot see it. The second type are described as those who carry the old blood and begin to remember. People who, for whatever reason, biological, spiritual, experiential, Investigative have begun to awaken to the reality of the transition, who ask the questions that the official frameworks can't answer, who follow the evidence wherever it goes, even when it goes somewhere uncomfortable. The Yankee texts address themselves to the second group. They describe what the second group needs to understand about the transition, about what is coming, and about what choices are available. The first instruction is orientation. Understand where you are in the cycle. Know that the disruptions you are witnessing are not random. They are sequential. They are predictable. They have a structure, a timeline, and a logic. The disorientation that characterizes the transition period, the sense that the world is becoming incomprehensible, that the old rules are no longer working, that institutions are failing, and certainties are dissolving, is not a malfunction. It is the process. The old age is completing, the new one is not yet established. The time between is exactly what it feels like. The second instruction is knowledge-seeking. The Yankee texts describe encoded knowledge as something that needs to be actively sought to be activated. This is not mystical, it has a cognitive and perhaps a biological basis, as the research on transgenerational epigenetic inheritance and default mode network activation suggests. The knowledge that the texts describe as encoded in the old blood doesn't activate automatically. It activates through specific practices, specific states of inquiry, specific orientations toward reality that create the conditions for what the texts describe as remembering. The third instruction is community. The Yankee texts describe the second group, those who are remembering, as scattered, potentially unaware of each other and needing to find one another. The convergence of the transition period requires the coordination of understanding, not isolated individual awakening. These instructions are, in many ways, exactly what the most thoughtful people asking these questions today have independently arrived at. The need to understand the larger cycle. The need to seek knowledge in places the official frameworks don't look. The need to build community among those who are asking the real questions. The Sumerians appear to have anticipated not just the events of the transition, but the state of mind required to navigate it. The archaeological evidence that's still coming. We have not yet excavated most of the Sumerian record. This is a fact that's easy to understate and important to keep in mind. The tablets we have are a fraction of what existed. The Iraq War, the looting of the Baghdad Museum in 2003, the ongoing instability in the region that is the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, all of these have limited access to sites and to collections. The Iraq Museum, before the 2003 looting, held approximately 170,000 objects from Mesopotamian civilizations. Approximately 14,000 were looted. Many have never been recovered. What was in them is unknown. There are excavated sites in southern Iraq, including the ancient city of Ur, the ruins of Nippur, the site of ancient Eridu, which Sumerian texts describe as the first city ever built, that have been partially excavated and partially studied, with vast sections remaining unexcavated due to funding limitations, political instability, and the sheer scale of the undertaking. And there are sites that haven't been excavated at all. Aerial photography and satellite imaging of the Mesopotamian plains has identified dozens of unexcavated mounds, tells that represent entire buried cities, their clay tablet libraries, still waiting under the sand. The tablets we have are enough to raise the questions we've been discussing. The tablets we don't have may contain answers that would end the debate entirely. This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for urgency. The research that is happening, the translation of existing tablets, the reassessment of records that have been cataloged but not deeply studied, the application of new archaeological and analytical techniques to sites and collections that were previously inaccessible is accelerating. Every year, more of the Sumerian record becomes available for serious study. And every year, the data from conventional science continues to confirm, in increasing detail, what the texts already describe. The convergence of ancient record and modern data is real, it is growing, and it is forcing the questions that need to be asked. The consciousness question. Before we close, we need to address one more dimension of the fifth prediction, the consciousness question, because it may be the most personally relevant of everything we've discussed. The Sumerian texts don't just describe external events. They describe an internal transformation that occurs in human beings during the transition period. And that transformation is described as the most important development of the entire cycle. The external events, the geological changes, the returning body, the visible presence of the Watchers are described as the context for this transformation, not the point of it. The context, the circumstances that create the conditions for something to happen in human consciousness that the Sumerians believed was the real purpose of the entire cycle. The Me tablets, the codes of civilization, describe humanity as an unfinished project, not a derogatory statement, a technical one. the Anunnaki, in the Sumerian account, created or modified humans for specific purposes. But the texts also describe an intended endpoint, a state of human capability and understanding that was the destination of the long development process. The state the texts call, in various translations, the full knowing, the complete memory, the open eye. This state is described as one in which the barrier between ordinary consciousness and what the texts call the deep mind becomes transparent, in which the knowledge encoded in the human genome, the accumulated understanding of however many previous cycles have contributed to human biology, becomes accessible, in which the individual human being can perceive the full scope of the cosmic context in which they exist. This is mystical language, but read it alongside the current research on consciousness, on the default mode network, on what psychedelic compounds reveal about the brain's capacity for expanded states of awareness, on the transgenerational inheritance of experiential memory, and it starts to look like something more than mysticism. It looks like a description of a biological capability that exists in the human system and that is currently being activated in millions of people by the specific conditions of the transition period. The extraordinary global surge of interest in meditation, contemplative practice, psychedelic therapy, and expanded states of consciousness is not a cultural accident. The Sumerian texts would say it is not a coincidence. They would say it is the species beginning to access what was always encoded within it, as the conditions of the convergence create the pressure needed to activate it. Whether or not you accept the Sumerian explanation for why this is happening, the phenomenon itself is real. The research is real. The experiential reports of millions of people worldwide who describe states of expanded knowing, of ancestral memory, of contact with something that feels both ancient and fundamentally familiar, these are real. Something is happening in human consciousness right now. The Sumerians said it would happen. They said it would happen in this period. And they said it was the point, not the geological changes, not the returning body, not even the visible presence of the watchers. The point was always the human awakening, the return of the full memory, the open eye. That is what the Enki texts were written to support. That is what the predictions were designed to orient. That is what 6,000 years of carefully preserved clay tablets, encoded with astronomical precision and addressed to the future, were ultimately for. The message decoded is this: you are at the convergence. You are the people the message was for. Remember what you are. Closing, the question that changes everything. 5 predictions, 5 verifiable data points, 1 ancient framework that holds them together, and a question that, once seriously asked, never stops being asked. If the Sumerians knew if whoever or whatever gave them their knowledge understood the solar system, the geology of the Earth, the biology of human beings, and the deep cycles of planetary and cosmic time, with enough precision to leave specific, verifiable predictions for the people who would be alive 6,000 years later, then what else did they know? What is in the tablets we haven't translated? What is in the sites we haven't excavated? What is encoded in the sacred geometries of the ancient monuments that dot the planet, all of them aligned with astronomical precision that our conventional historical framework cannot explain? What is in the human genome, waiting in the sequences we still call junk, for the conditions that the Sumerian texts describe as the trigger for activation? What is the full scope of what the Anunnaki gave, and what is the full purpose of why they gave it? These are not answerable questions in this video. They are not answerable in this decade, probably. They are the questions that the next generation of researchers, the ones willing to follow the evidence past the boundaries of current academic comfort, will spend their careers on. But here is the answerable question, the one that each person watching this can sit with right now without waiting for institutional permission. If the third prediction is happening and the data says it is, then the framework that contains it is likely real. And if the framework is real, then predictions 4 and 5 are not in the past. They are ahead of us. The memory is awakening. The watchers are becoming visible. And the convergence that the Sumerians described, the great transition, the age shift, the moment when everything that was hidden becomes visible, is not coming. It is here. What do you do with that? What does it change about how you understand your own history, your own species, your own moment in time? That is the question the Sumerians left for you, pressed into clay, sealed in jars, buried under the sand of what used to be the garden of the world, and waiting, across 6,000 years of human forgetting and human searching, for exactly the moment you would be ready to hear it. There is a storage room in the basement of the British Museum that most people who visit the museum will never see. It holds thousands of clay tablets, Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, many of them cataloged but not yet fully translated. Not because the museum lacks interest, and not because the tablets aren't significant. Simply because the number of cuneiform specialists in the world is small, The volume of material is enormous, and the work is slow. The British Museum's cuneiform collection contains approximately 130,000 tablets and fragments. Of those, roughly 30,000 have been published in some form. The remaining 100,000, by the museum's own accounting, await full scholarly attention. 100,000 untranslated Mesopotamian clay tablets, in one institution. The University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology holds another large collection. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad, before the 2003 looting, held one of the most significant collections in the world, with material that has never been fully catalogued. The Louvre in Paris has extensive Mesopotamian holdings. Smaller collections exist at institutions across Europe and North America, many of them similarly backlogged. When researchers have gone through previously catalogued but under-examined portions of these collections, the discoveries have been significant. In 2015, a tablet in the British Museum's collection that had been catalogued in the 1800s was subjected to new analysis and found to contain what appears to be a sophisticated flood narrative fragment predating the Atrahasis, text that scholars had previously identified as the oldest flood account. The discovery reshaped the scholarly understanding of the textual tradition around flood narratives and the relationship between Mesopotamian flood accounts and the biblical Genesis. In 2016, a tablet in the Sulaymaniyah Museum in Iraq that had been acquired in the antiquities market, meaning it was either excavated illegally or preserved by locals, during a period of instability was found to contain a detailed description of the Garden of Eden narrative that is significantly more specific than the biblical account. And that includes details about the geography and species composition of the garden that are independently verifiable against what we know about the ecology of ancient Mesopotamia at the relevant time. Period. These discoveries, as remarkable as they are, represent the tip of the iceberg of what the unread portions of these collections likely contain. What are the chances that among the 100,000 untranslated tablets in the British Museum alone, there are no additional detailed astronomical prediction tables? No additional geographical descriptions of future geological events? No additional specific accounts of the Anunnaki and their timeline for the transition period? The chances are low, vanishingly low. Given what we found in the portion of the collection that has been examined, the prediction is that more examinations will yield more predictions. The research is being done, slowly, by a dedicated community of scholars. And the work is accelerating, partly because of digital imaging technologies that make cuneiform more accessible to analysis, and partly because of a growing awareness that the conventional academic framework for understanding these texts, mythology, religion, primitive cosmology, may be insufficient to capture what's actually in them. The Enuma Elish is usually discussed in comparative religion as a creation epic with parallels to the Genesis narrative in the Bible. The parallels are real and significant: the seven-day structure, the sequence of creation events, the role of a divine wind and primordial waters, and the scholarly work on the literary relationship between the two texts is substantial. But what the Enuma Elish is not usually discussed as is an astronomical text, and it is also an astronomical text. Zecharia Sitchin was the first to make this argument in detail in his 1976 book, The 12th Planet. His argument was that the Enuma Elish is not primarily a creation myth, but a description of the formation of the solar system, specifically the collision that created the Earth and the Moon, described in terms that would have been meaningful to the Sumerians using the vocabulary and conceptual framework available to them. The seventh tablet of the Enuma Elish describes a celestial body called Tiamat and its collision with another large body. The result of this collision is the creation of the Earth and the asteroid belt. The technical description, in the Sumerian text, of a planet-scale collision that produces a surviving fragment and a debris field is, Sitchin argued, an account of the late heavy bombardment or a proto-Earth collision event described in terms appropriate to a 4th millennium BCE audience. The giant impact hypothesis, the mainstream scientific model for the formation of the Earth and Moon, proposes that approximately 4.5 billion years ago, a Mars-sized body called Theia collided with the proto-Earth. The collision ejected enormous amounts of material into orbit, some of which coalesced to form the Moon, while the remainder, the debris from both the proto-Earth and Theia, formed a ring of material, some of which was swept up by the surviving bodies, and some of which remained in orbit as debris. The Enuma Elish describes a collision between Tiamat and a large invader. The result is the formation of the Earth described as the surviving fragment of Tiamat, and the formation of what the text calls the hammered bracelet, a ring of debris, which is described as lying between the territory of the surviving body and the outer reaches of the solar system. This hammered bracelet is, in the solar system's geography, exactly where the asteroid belt is located. The description of a planet-scale collision creating both a surviving planet and a debris belt between the inner and outer solar system is not a description that could be derived from naked-eye observation of the sky. It is a description of a physical event that modern science reconstructed from orbital mechanics, radiometric dating, and geophysical analysis. The Sumerians described it in the Enuma Elish. How? The mainstream answer is that the Enuma Elish is mythology and shouldn't be read as a physical description of solar system formation. This is a reasonable hermeneutic position. The problem is that the details of the description, the hammered bracelet in the right orbital location, the collision producing the Earth from a surviving fragment of a larger body, the involvement of water in the collision dynamics are not what you would produce if you were inventing a creation story. They are what you would produce if you were recording, in symbolic language, an actual account of the physical events. The giant impact hypothesis was not fully developed as a scientific model until the 1970s. It wasn't widely accepted until the 1980s. The Enuma Elish was written before 2000 BCE. The question remains, how did they know? One of the most extraordinary and contested claims in the Sumerian texts is the claim that the Anunnaki were directly involved in the creation or modification of human beings. The Mi tablets describe a process of creating workers, a race called the Lulu Amalu, sometimes translated as primitive worker, who were made in the account by mixing the essence of the Anunnaki with clay, which most researchers interpret as a description of biological material combined with earth material. The conventional reading is mythological. The gods made humanity from clay, as many ancient traditions describe, a metaphor for divine creation. The unconventional reading, which is supported by a literal translation of the relevant passages, is that the Anunnaki conducted a genetic modification of an existing hominid species to create a workforce, using their own biological material combined with the existing species' genetics. This is the claim that critics of the ancient astronaut interpretation find most objectionable, partly because it does have racist implications if applied carelessly, and partly because it sounds so far outside scientific credibility. And yet, the human genome has some features that geneticists have been struggling to fully explain within conventional evolutionary frameworks for decades. The first is the speed and apparent completeness of certain distinctly human genetic features. The suite of genetic changes associated with uniquely human cognitive capabilities, the FOXP2 gene associated with complex language, the ASPM and microcephalin genes associated with brain size, the genetic basis for symbolic thinking and behavioral modernity, appear in the fossil record and the genetic record in a way that some researchers describe as unexpectedly abrupt. Not overnight, but compressed compared to the gradual accumulation expected from natural selection acting on random variation. The second is what was mentioned earlier, the large proportion of the human genome that is non-coding. More recent research has begun to identify functions for some of these sequences, but a substantial portion remains, in the current literature, of unknown function. Some of these sequences show evidence of insertion, that is, they appear to have been introduced into the genome from external sources, rather than having evolved in place. Horizontal gene transfer, the process by which genetic material moves between organisms through mechanisms other than reproduction, is well established in prokaryotes and increasingly recognized in eukaryotes. The idea that human evolution was influenced by horizontal gene transfer events, including, potentially, from sources that the conventional model doesn't currently account for, is not scientifically impossible. It is outside the current mainstream model, but the mainstream model has been revised on this question multiple times in the last 2 decades, as evidence for ancient horizontal gene transfer in the human lineage has accumulated. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki conducting what amounts to a directed genetic modification program on an existing hominid population. If you translate the Sumerian description into modern biological language, what you get is selection of a viable hominid host species, introduction of genetic material from another source, and directed cultivation of the resulting hybrid line to produce specific cognitive and physical characteristics. This is not a claim that can currently be verified or falsified. The genomic tools to test it, the ability to fully characterize the ancient human genome and compare it to a known reference for what the pre-modification line should have looked like, don't exist yet. Ancient DNA research is advancing rapidly, but we don't yet have the full genomic picture of human evolution at the level of resolution this question requires. What we do have is the accumulating evidence that the human genome is stranger, and human evolution was faster and more complex than the simplest natural selection models predict. And we have a 6,000-year-old text that claims to describe exactly what happened, The Enki texts add another layer to this. They describe the modification as intentional and purposeful, not just for labor, but for eventual cognitive development. The Sumerian account describes a deliberate trajectory. Create workers, then gradually over many generations, many cycles guide those workers toward the full cognitive capabilities that would eventually allow them to understand and utilize the knowledge encoded in the me. In this reading, human history is not a random walk of evolutionary development and cultural accident. It is a guided process. A very long, very patient program of development, conducted over timescales that make human historical memory, even written historical memory going back 6,000 years, look like the final paragraph of a very long book. Whether this is true is not something we can say definitively. But the coherence of the claim, its internal consistency across multiple Sumerian texts written over centuries, and its increasingly interesting resonances with the findings of modern genetics, make dismissing it on the grounds of pure impossibility harder than it used to be. Beyond the physical predictions, the geological, the astronomical, the biological, the Sumerian texts contain a sustained and sophisticated discussion of consciousness that deserves separate treatment. The Sumerians described human consciousness as layered. They distinguished between the body and what they called the giddim, roughly translatable as spirit or animating principle. They described a deeper layer still, which they called the mitana, something like the essential self or the higher awareness. And they described the potential for human consciousness to expand into what they called the Kigal, the great earth knowledge, and ultimately into what the texts call the Angal, the great sky knowledge. This four-level model of consciousness, physical body, animating spirit, essential self, and expanded cosmic awareness is not unique to the Sumerians. It appears in various forms in ancient Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, and Mesoamerican traditions. The fact that it appears consistently across cultures that had no known contact with each other is one of the arguments that these traditions are preserving a shared ancient source rather than independently developing parallel ideas. The Enki text describes specific practices, states of deep stillness, specific breath patterns, specific states of focused attention that the texts claim enable movement between the layers of consciousness. They describe the giddim as the mediator, the conduit between the physical and the essential self. They describe specific conditions, particular environmental settings, astronomical alignments, specific states of physical and mental preparation that facilitate expansion into the Kigal and the Angal. This is the language of what we would call contemplative or mystical practice, and it is sophisticated, more sophisticated in its specificity and its precision than what you would expect from a culture inventing religious practice from scratch. The parallels with what modern neuroscience is discovering about the brain's capacity for non-ordinary states of consciousness are striking. The default mode network research we mentioned earlier has identified a brain state associated with rest, internal processing, and what researchers cautiously describe as states of expanded awareness. This state is associated with specific neurochemical conditions, including the natural production of compounds similar to those found in psychedelic substances, and with specific physiological conditions, including deep relaxation and reduced sensory input. The conditions the Enki texts describe for accessing the higher layers of consciousness, deep stillness, specific breath work, reduced external stimulation, are the conditions that modern neuroscience has identified as activating the default mode network and the states of consciousness associated with it. The Sumerians appear to have had a detailed, functional understanding of how human consciousness works at a neurological level, described, of course, in the vocabulary of their time rather than in the vocabulary of modern neuroscience, but tracking the same underlying reality with remarkable precision. And the predictions about consciousness that the veil would thin during the transition period, that the second type of people would begin to remember, that the full knowing would become accessible can be read as predictions about the neurological and cultural conditions of the transition period, making these states of consciousness more accessible than they have been during the periods when the old age was stable and closed. The research boom in psychedelic therapy, meditation science, and consciousness studies that we are living through right now is, in the Sumerian framework, exactly what was predicted. And it is producing exactly what the texts describe would be produced: access to states of awareness that feel, to those who experience them, like remembering something ancient and fundamental rather than discovering something new. Before we move to the final section, we need to spend more time on the physical monuments, because the physical record of prehistorical knowledge is arguably more compelling than any textual record, precisely because it cannot be dismissed as mistranslation or interpretive projection. Consider the following set of facts, none of which are disputed by mainstream archaeology. The Great Pyramid at Giza aligns to true north with an accuracy of 3/60 of a degree more accurately than the Paris Observatory, which was built in 1667 with the specific goal of being oriented to true north. The pyramid's base is level to within 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter base length. The four corners are almost perfect right angles, within 12 seconds of arc of true 90 degrees. The outer casing stones, which originally covered the pyramid and are now largely removed, were fitted together with tolerances of 0.5 millimeters or less. These are not the achievements of a primitive technology. These are achievements that would challenge a modern construction project with GPS navigation, laser leveling, and computer-aided design. The pyramid's internal dimensions encode pi and phi, the mathematical constants in their proportions. This is demonstrable from the measurements and is not a fringe claim. The height of the pyramid in relation to the base circumference gives pi. The relationship of the height to the apothem gives phi. These are either intentional or coincidental, and the precision of the encoding makes coincidence increasingly implausible. The pyramid also encodes the size of the Earth. The original height of the pyramid, 146.5 meters, relates to the circumference of the Earth at the latitude of Giza in a ratio of 143/200. The number 43,200 is also significant in the precessional calculation. It is the number of years it takes for the equinoxes to precess through exactly 60 degrees of arc, and it appears in Sumerian mathematical tables. The encoding appears to be deliberate. The Sumerians didn't build the pyramids. The Egyptians did, but the Egyptians themselves claimed their knowledge came from what they called the first time, or Zep Tepi, a period of great wisdom that preceded dynastic Egypt and was associated with gods who came down from the sky. The Egyptian concept of Zep Tepi parallels the Sumerian concept of the antediluvian period, the time before the flood when the Anunnaki were directly present and civilization was established. If both traditions are pointing backward to the same source, a shared prehistoric civilization that understood pi, phi, the size and shape of the Earth, the precession of the equinoxes, and the mathematics of the solar system, then the physical monuments are the most durable evidence of that civilization's existence. They are built in stone. Stone lasts. Clay tablets are fragile, dependent on dry conditions, and can be destroyed. Stone structures, properly built, are almost permanent. The locations of the major ancient monuments are not random. Studies of the geographical distribution of megalithic and pyramidal structures worldwide, Giza, Teotihuacan, Angkor Wat, the Easter Island statues, the Nazca lines, Göbekli Tepe, the stone circles of Britain, the megalithic temples of Malta, show clustering patterns that correlate with astronomical alignments and with the precessional cycle. Some researchers have proposed that the global distribution of these sites constitutes a coordinate system, a planetary grid whose logic becomes apparent only when the precessional cycle is taken into account. This is a contested claim. The peer-reviewed literature is sparse on it. But the individual alignments at specific sites are not contested, they are confirmed by mainstream archaeology. And the convergence of those individual alignments into a consistent, coherent global pattern is hard to explain as coincidence across dozens of independent cultures separated by oceans and millennia. If the pattern is real, if the ancient monuments are a coordinate system, a memory storage device, a communication system for future generations, then their builders had a global view of the Earth and a long-term planning horizon that our conventional human prehistory cannot account for. And if they had that, if someone or something built a planetary-scale monument system designed to preserve and transmit knowledge across the kind of timescales that make ordinary human memory unreliable, then we are living in the time those builders planned for. We are the generation they were building for. The knowledge they encoded in stone, in mathematical proportions, and astronomical alignments was encoded for the people who would be sophisticated enough to decode it. We are, very recently, becoming sophisticated enough. The last century of archaeology, archaeoastronomy, and archaeometry has given us the tools to begin reading what the ancient builders encoded. And what we're finding is consistent with what the Sumerian tablets describe. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki not as a monolithic group with a single purpose, but as a council with internal disagreements about how to proceed with humanity. This internal tension is one of the most interesting and, paradoxically, credibility-lending aspects of the texts. The texts describe a fundamental disagreement between two figures. Enlil, who is associated with air, authority, and what might be described as a conservative management philosophy regarding humanity, and Enki, who is associated with water, knowledge, and a more developmental philosophy regarding humanity's potential. In the Atrahasis account of the flood, Enlil is the one who decides that the human population should be destroyed. They have become too numerous, too noisy, and in certain passages, too independent. Enki is the one who intervenes to preserve a remnant, instructing Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah, to build a vessel and survive the catastrophe. This tension between the Anunnaki who view humanity as a resource to be managed and the Anunnaki who view humanity as a project to be developed runs through many of the texts. And it maps, in an interesting way, onto a question that appears in the research of people who have had deep contact experiences with what they describe as non-human intelligences, experiences reported in indigenous traditions worldwide, in the abduction literature, in the deep psychedelic state literature, and in the emerging testimonies of people associated with UAP contact. The consistent report from these varied sources is not of a single unified non-human intelligence with a single unified purpose. It is of multiple intelligences, with different orientations toward humanity, different levels of involvement in human affairs, and different views on what the human potential is and how to develop it. This is not the picture of alien mythology that popular culture has given us. It is the picture that the Sumerian texts described, thousands of years before the modern contact literature existed, to independently confirm it. The Enlil-Enki tension in the Sumerian texts describes exactly what the modern contact literature describes. Some entities that appear to want to manage and limit humanity, and some entities that appear to want to develop and liberate it. The former group associated with restriction, with flooding, with the suppression of knowledge. The latter group associated with the gift of knowledge, with the preservation of human potential, with the encoding of information for future generations. If this is a literal account rather than a mythology, and the modern contact literature provides an uncomfortable amount of independent confirmation that it might be, then the question of which group's intentions are currently operative is not an abstract historical question. It is a live and consequential one. The Enki texts describe the transition period, the convergence we are living through, as a time when the balance shifts. When the knowledge that was suppressed or forgotten becomes accessible again, when the veil between the sleeping mind and the knowing mind thins, when the Igigi become visible, and the process of disclosure that the Sumerians described as the opening of the eye becomes irreversible. In the Sumerian framework, the transition period is precisely the time when the Enlil program suppression, management, limitation loses its grip, and the Enki program knowledge, development, awakening gains traction. Whether you read this literally or metaphorically, as an account of actual non-human political dynamics, or as an encoded description of internal human dynamics, the tension between forces that seek to limit human potential and forces that seek to expand it, the frame is coherent. And the moment we are in, with its peculiar combination of institutional control attempting to limit information and extraordinary access to information simultaneously exploding through technology and research, looks very much like the transition the texts describe. Something is cracking open. The texts say it would. And the question the Enki program poses to each person living through it is the same question it has always posed. Will you look? Will you remember? Will you carry the knowledge forward to those who come after? One of the most poignant aspects of the Sumerian record, if you read it with this framework in mind, is the awareness that the knowledge encoded in it might be lost. The Enki texts describe a fear, not a certainty, but a fear that the great forgetting will be more complete than intended. That even with the encoding in biology, in stone, in astronomical alignments, in clay tablets, the period of suppression and cultural disruption will be long enough that the message might not reach the people it was intended for in comprehensible form. This appears to be what happened. The Sumerian civilization was conquered, and its records were partially absorbed into Babylonian, Assyrian, and later Hellenistic traditions, each transmission losing some fidelity with the original. The clay tablets were scattered, buried, destroyed. The Anunnaki knowledge, as the Sumerians recorded it, was gradually mythologized, transformed from a literal technical account into a religious story, from a description of physical beings into a pantheon of gods, from a precise astronomical framework into an astrological system, divorced from its original physical basis. The memory became short. The long memory, the multi-thousand-year view, the understanding of the precessional cycles, the knowledge of the solar system's deep mechanics, the awareness of what the returning body means and when it comes, was compressed into symbol, metaphor, and religious ritual. Still present, but encoded so heavily that only those with the specific knowledge to decode it could access it in its original form. The 19th century archaeologists who began excavating Mesopotamia, the cuneiformists who began translating the tablets, the scholars who reconstructed the Sumerian language from scratch, they began the process of recovering the long memory. Sitchin, Whatever his critics say about the precision of his translations, extended that recovery by taking the literal descriptions seriously. And the researchers working today in astronomy, geology, oceanography, genetics, consciousness studies, and archaeology are, often without knowing it, producing the data that reactivates the long memory from the other direction. Not by starting from the texts and finding the data, but by producing the data and discovering, as it accumulates, that the texts already described it. The long memory is recovering from both directions simultaneously. From the textual scholarship recovering what the Sumerians wrote, and from the scientific research generating data that the Sumerian texts already contained, the recovery is real. It is happening now. And it is, in the framework the texts themselves provide, exactly what was planned. The Enki texts close in the portions that have survived and been translated with what can best be described as a direct address to the future. Not a prayer, not a prophecy. A message, clear-eyed, specific, and deliberately composed for people the writer knew would not exist for thousands of years. The message, as best as it can be rendered in modern English from the fragmentary Sumerian, reads approximately as follows. You who find this, you who have lived long enough into the great time to see the signs we described, you who carry what was given to the old blood and who have begun to feel it stir. You are not the first to feel this, and you will not be the last, but you are the ones for whom it matters most, because you are the ones in the turn of the wheel. The knowledge we gave was not for those who received it from us. It was given through them, for you. We did not give it to the Sumerians. We gave it to humanity, and we gave it at the beginning of the long memory, so that it would have time to travel to you. What we gave is this. You are more than your short memory. The long memory is in you. The sky we mapped is in you. The deep cycles are in you. The full knowing is not lost. It was never lost. It was only sleeping, in the deep mind, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to wake. The conditions are now. The wheel has turned. The sky is arranged, as we described it would be. The earth is moving as we said it would move. The fires below are awake. The watchers are returning to visibility. And you, the ones reading this, the ones living through this, are the reason all of it was set in motion. Remember what you are. Not what you were taught you are. Not what the short memory says you are. What you actually are, in the long memory, where the full knowing lives. You were built for this. Specifically and deliberately, across more generations than your history can count, for exactly this moment. The Great Ton is here. Remember, that is what the clay says. That is what 6,000 years of careful preservation was working toward. 5 predictions, 1 framework, 1 message. And the data, from astronomy and geology and oceanography and genetics and neuroscience and the ongoing cascade of UAP disclosures, keeps confirming it. The Sumerians knew. Whoever told them, knew. And now, you know too. If this is the kind of investigation that matters to you, if you're the kind of person who needs to ask the questions that don't have comfortable answers, subscribe. This channel is built for exactly that kind of person. Hit the bell. And if you want to go deeper on any of the specific predictions we covered today, the next video is already queued up. The long memory is waking up. You should be there for what comes next. The deeper archaeology, sites that shouldn't exist. There is a list of sites that mainstream archaeology acknowledges, studies, and then quietly sets aside because they don't fit the standard model of human prehistory. They are not disputed. They are excavated. They are carbon dated. They are measured and analyzed and published in peer-reviewed journals. And then they are placed in a mental category that amounts to, we know this is real, we don't know what to do with it, so we acknowledge it and move on. Göbekli Tepe is the most famous of these sites, but it is far from alone. Gunung Padang in West Java, Indonesia, is a terraced megalithic site that a 2023 core drilling analysis published in the journal Archaeological Prospection found to have construction layers dating as far back as 25,000 to 14,000 years ago. The analysis found worked stone and constructed features at depths that correspond, by carbon dating of the organic material found with them, to the height of the last ice age. If these dates hold up to further scrutiny, and the study has been peer-reviewed, though it has generated controversy, then Gunung Padang contains evidence of structured human construction activity more than 20,000 years ago. 20,000 years ago! That is 12,000 years before Göbekli Tepe, and 16,000 years before the Sumerians. The Yonaguni Monument in Japan is an underwater structure discovered by divers off the coast of Yonaguni Island in 1987. It consists of large, flat, terraced stone formations, some of which display what appears to be tooling marks, right angles, and structural relationships that suggest artificial construction. The site sits at a depth consistent with sea levels during the last ice age, which would have ended approximately 11,600 years ago. Masaki Kimura, a professor of marine geology at the University of the Ryukyus, spent years diving the site and argued, in published academic work, that it shows evidence of human construction. The mainstream consensus is divided, with some researchers seeing natural geological formation and others seeing evidence of artificial construction. The Bimini Road in the Bahamas is a formation of large, flat stones discovered underwater in 1968, lying approximately 18 feet below the current sea surface on the Bahamian continental shelf. The stones are arranged in what appears to be a paved path or road. Marine geologists have argued both for natural beach rock formation and for artificial construction. The depth at which the stones lie is consistent with shoreline levels approximately 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. Underwater structures have been reported and photographed off the coast of Cuba, in the Gulf of Combat in India, where side-scan sonar surveys revealed what appeared to be geometric structures at a depth suggesting submersion 9,500 years ago, off the coast of Malta and in the Gulf of Mexico. None of these sites, taken individually, constitutes definitive proof of a pre-Ice Age advanced civilization. But collectively, they describe a pattern. The distribution of sites that either clearly or possibly predate the conventional timeline of human civilization is consistent with a global coastal civilization that was inundated when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. The Sumerian texts describe this. The Atrahasis flood account, the Gilgamesh flood account, the biblical flood, all of these are describing, within their cultural frameworks, the same historical event. The catastrophic sea level rise at the end of the Younger Dryas, approximately 11,600 years ago, that inundated the coastal lands where whatever predecessor civilization existed had built its greatest works. The flood is not mythology. The flood is geology. It happened. The sea level rise at the end of the last ice age is one of the best documented geological events in human history. The question is not whether the flood happened. The question is whether a civilization sophisticated enough to leave Göbekli Tepe, to build structures whose geometry encodes pi and the size of the Earth, to map the sky and calculate the precessional cycle, was destroyed by it. The answer, increasingly, appears to be yes. And the Sumerians, who appeared in the archaeological record shortly after the flood, with a complete civilization that they claimed was given to them, may have been the inheritors. The survivors or the students of survivors who received the condensed, portable version of the drowned civilization's knowledge and encoded it in clay so that it would not be lost again. The tablets we are reading, the predictions we are studying, may be the last transmission of a civilization far older and far more sophisticated than the Sumerians themselves. A civilization whose physical works now lie underwater, whose name we don't know, whose history has been compressed and mythologized into the flood accounts of every culture on Earth. The Sumerians called the period before the flood the antediluvian period, the time of the kingships that lasted, in the royal lists they compiled, for hundreds of thousands of years. Mainstream scholars dismiss these timeframes as mythological inflation. But the Sumerian king lists are otherwise remarkably accurate for the post-flood period. The names and sequences check out against other sources. Why would the pre-flood section of the same list be pure invention? The Sumerian word for the pre-flood civilization, when the Anunnaki were directly present and civilization was at its greatest, is not myth. It is S-U-D, the very old life, the ancient breath. It is remembered as a real time, a real place, a real civilization. Not a story, a history, the oldest history, the one that ends with water and begins again with clay. We are, right now, developing the tools underwater archaeology, deep ocean imaging, ancient DNA analysis, archaeogenomics, satellite remote sensing of submerged coastlines that could, within the next generation, either confirm or definitively rule out the existence of a pre-Ice Age advanced civilization. If it is confirmed, then everything changes, not just the academic model. The story of what humanity is, where it came from, how old the deep tradition of knowledge is, and what the Sumerian predictions actually represent, all of it transforms. That transformation may itself be part of what the Sumerian predictions describe as the Great Awakening of the transition period, the return of the long memory. Let us close with the honest calibration that the subject requires. Not everything in the ancient astronaut interpretation of Sumerian texts is verifiable. Some of it is speculation. Some of Sitchin's specific translations have been challenged by linguists with legitimate expertise in Sumerian and Akkadian. The interpretation of specific astronomical symbols is not always unambiguous. The 5 predictions we described exist on a spectrum of verifiability. The deep ocean thermal anomalies and their correspondence to the Atrahasis description, high specificity, current data, verifiable right now. The East African Rift correspondence, high specificity, documented and ongoing. The UAP disclosure progression, high specificity, publicly documented. The precession of the equinoxes knowledge confirmed by conventional scholarship. The existence of a large outer solar system body, hypothetically proposed by conventional science, not yet directly observed. The degree to which any of this constitutes proof of the ancient astronaut interpretation depends on standards of evidence that reasonable people can differ on. What it constitutes, beyond dispute, is a set of remarkable correspondences that deserve more serious investigation than they have received. The institutions that could most rigorously test these correspondences, major universities, government research programs, well-funded scientific journals operate within frameworks that make this investigation difficult to pursue through conventional channels. That is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of how knowledge systems maintain their coherence. The investigation is happening anyway, through independent researchers, through people who came out of conventional academic training and found themselves following evidence past the edges of what their institutions could accommodate. Through the growing community of scientists who have experienced the correspondences we described and who discuss them privately while they continue their conventional work. What does 2026 look like in this framework? The third prediction, the deep fires, the ocean thermal anomaly, the marine ecosystem disruption, is in full progression. The data continues to accumulate. The official scientific explanation for the anomalous warming remains incomplete. The Atrahasis description continues to match what the instruments are recording. The fifth prediction, the visibility of the watchers, the UAP disclosure, is in active progression. The escalation from institutional denial to official acknowledgement to congressional testimony to legislative action to ongoing institutional reckoning is continuing on a trajectory that shows no sign of reversing. The fourth prediction, the awakening of memory. The thinning of the veil is harder to quantify but culturally undeniable. The global surge of interest in consciousness, ancient knowledge, psychedelic therapy, meditation science, and what people are increasingly describing as a sense of remembering rather than discovering, shows no sign of abating. The second prediction, the geological signature, the rifting is documented and ongoing, opening at a rate that may be accelerating. The first prediction, the return of the crossing body, remains the most uncertain, depending on whether Planet 9 is confirmed and whether its orbital parameters match the Sumerian description. The search continues. The gravitational evidence for something significant in the outer solar system continues to accumulate. The confirmation, if it comes, could come any year. 2026 is not the end of anything. It is not the year of apocalypse. It is not the year when the Anunnaki return in fleets of visible craft. The Sumerian texts don't describe the transition as a single dramatic day. They describe it as a period, a generation, a sustained, intensifying convergence of the cycles that the deep time of the solar system and the Earth's own dynamics have been building toward for thousands of years. We are in it. We have been in it for approximately 2 decades, by the alignment of the sequences. We will continue to be in it for decades more. But 2026 is specifically marked by the convergence of the third and fifth sequences reaching their most active phase. The deep fires at their most visible. The watchers at the threshold of what the texts call the open acknowledgement. And the memory awakening at a level of cultural and scientific intensity that has no modern parallel. This is the year not of resolution, but of no longer being able to pretend the questions aren't being asked. The year when the convergence of sequences the Sumerians described becomes hard enough to ignore that even the institutions that have been most resistant to acknowledging it find themselves forced into engagement with it. That is what the Sumerian texts predicted for this period. Watch the ocean temperatures. Watch the UAP disclosure trajectory. Watch the consciousness research. Watch the East African Rift. Watch the outer solar system search. The prediction is not that all of this resolves in 2026. The prediction is that all of this becomes undeniable in 2026. Look at the evidence. Draw your own conclusions. Follow the questions wherever they lead. That is, in the end, what the Enki program has always been. The invitation to look, to see, to remember. The clay is speaking. Are you listening? There is one more dimension of Sumerian knowledge that we have not yet addressed, and it is the one that, in certain respects, is most personal, most immediate, most directly relevant to each person watching. The Sumerian medical tradition. When scholars first began translating Sumerian medical texts in the late 19th and early 20th century, the expectation was to find something similar to what they had found in Egyptian medical papyri, a mixture of rational, clinical observation and magical incantation, useful for understanding ancient superstition but not particularly illuminating for modern medicine. What they found was more sophisticated than that. The Sumerian medical texts, which survive in collections, including the series known as Diagnostic Handbook and the Medical Compendium, sometimes called the Treatise of Medical Diagnosis and Prognoses, describe symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments with a clinical specificity that has surprised modern physicians who have reviewed them. The texts describe what are recognizably cardiovascular symptoms, neurological symptoms, gastrointestinal conditions, and infectious diseases with a diagnostic precision that requires careful, systematic clinical observation. But what is most interesting, for our purposes, is not the clinical medicine. It is the theoretical framework behind it. The Sumerian medical system was based on the premise that the human body is a microcosm of the cosmos, not as a vague metaphor, but as a literal structural claim. The Sumerian physicians described the human body as reflecting, in miniature, the structure of the solar system. Each organ corresponds to a planetary influence. Each biological cycle corresponds to an astronomical cycle. Each disease process corresponds to a disruption in the relationship between the inner microcosm and the outer macrocosm. This is the as above, so below principle, and it appears in Sumerian medicine long before it appears in Greek, Egyptian, or any other ancient tradition. The Hermetic tradition that would later develop this principle in the Mediterranean world traces its intellectual lineage, through various transmission paths, back to Mesopotamia. The practical application in Sumerian medicine was the timing of treatments. Certain interventions were prescribed for specific astronomical conditions. Certain herbs were to be harvested at specific points in lunar cycles. Certain conditions were diagnosed differently depending on the time of year relative to the precessional calendar. Modern chronobiology, the scientific study of biological rhythms and their relationship to temporal cycles, has confirmed that many physiological processes in the human body are synchronized with environmental cycles, including light-dark cycles, lunar cycles, and seasonal cycles. The circadian rhythm is the most familiar example, but research has extended the documentation of biological cycle synchronization to much longer timeframes, including monthly cycles correlated with lunar phases and annual cycles correlated with seasonal changes. The Sumerian claim that the human body is synchronized with astronomical cycles is, in its general structure, confirmed by modern biology. The specific correspondence the Sumerians mapped, which organ to which planet, which symptom to which astronomical condition, hasn't been tested in any rigorous modern study because no modern study has been designed to test it. The framework is too far outside the current medical paradigm to generate research funding. But the foundational premise that biological processes are synchronized with cosmic cycles is not fringe. It is established science, and within the Sumerian framework, this has direct implications for the transition period. If biological processes are synchronized with astronomical cycles, and if the precessional transition represents a major astronomical shift, then the human body is not merely an observer of the transition. It is a participant. The biological systems of every person alive during the transition are responding to the same astronomical forces that are reshaping the geological and atmospheric systems of the Earth. The anomalies in human biology that we might expect to see during a major precessional transition, changes in sleep patterns, changes in immune function, changes in neurological activity, changes in the experience of time and consciousness would not be random. They would be synchronized. They would appear simultaneously across the global population. Does this sound familiar? The extraordinary global surge in sleep disorders. The documented increases in anxiety and stress-related illness. The widespread reports of time perception changes the sense that time is moving faster, that the years feel compressed. The global increase in what researchers call high sensitivity traits, heightened sensory awareness, heightened emotional responsiveness, heightened pattern recognition. The explosion of what are now being called neurodivergent conditions, ADHD, autism spectrum conditions whose rates have increased dramatically over the last 2 decades. These are all, in the Sumerian medical framework, exactly what you would expect to see in a population of human bodies that are biologically synchronized with the astronomical cycles of a major precessional transition. Not disease. Not dysfunction. Adaptation. Biological reorganization for the demands of a new age. The Sumerian medical texts describe the human body during transition periods as going through what they call a retuning, an adjustment period during which old synchronizations are disrupting and new ones are establishing, during which what worked in the old cycle no longer works, and what will work in the new cycle is not yet fully established, during which the human nervous system is, quite literally, being upgraded. That description, a global retuning of the human nervous system, manifesting as widespread disruption of established biological patterns, is a reasonable description of what the data on global mental and physical health patterns over the last 2 decades shows. The Sumerians predicted this too, not explicitly as a specific event, but as the inherent biological consequence of the macrocosmic conditions they did explicitly predict. If the astronomical conditions of the precessional transition are what the texts say they are, and if the human body is synchronized with those conditions the way the medical texts say it is, then the biological patterns of the transition period are predictable from first principles, and they match what we observe. The Sumerians were not alone in recording knowledge of the kind we've been discussing. The Egyptian, Indian, Mayan, and Chinese traditions all contain astronomical records of comparable sophistication and comparable mystery. They all describe, in their respective frameworks, beings from the sky who gave humanity the foundations of civilization. They all describe cycles of cosmic time yugas in the Indian tradition, suns in the Mesoamerican tradition, great years in the Egyptian and Greek traditions that correspond to the precessional cycle. The convergence of independent ancient traditions on the same set of astronomical, geological, and cosmological claims is not coincidental. The probability that multiple independent cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, would independently develop the same specific incorrect astronomical knowledge is effectively zero. The probability that they independently observed and recorded the same correct astronomical knowledge is also low, given that some of it, the outer planets, the precise precessional period is not directly observable by the techniques available to ancient humans. The most parsimonious explanation for the convergence of ancient traditions on a coherent and largely accurate body of astronomical and geological knowledge is that they share a common source. Not through direct cultural contact across oceans, though some of that may have occurred, but through the shared inheritance of a predecessor tradition whose knowledge was distributed globally before the catastrophe that ended it. The Sumerian texts are, in this reading, one node in a global network of preserved knowledge. Not the only node. Not necessarily the most complete node, but the most textually explicit, the most literal, the most direct, the most technically specific in its claims. And the network as a whole, Sumerian, Egyptian, Indian, Mayan, Chinese, indigenous traditions worldwide, describes the same transition, the same cycle, the same convergence from different cultural angles. They all say the same thing. In different languages, through different symbolic systems, with different gods' names, but the same underlying message. We are at the turn of the great wheel. The long sleep is ending. Remember what you are. That convergence of traditions, pointing to this moment, is itself perhaps the most powerful of all the predictions. Not the specific geological or astronomical details. The simple fact that every ancient tradition with roots deep enough to carry the long memory is pointing at now. All of them, simultaneously. The clay tablets say it, the stone circles say it, the pyramid orientations say it. The Mayan calendar said it not as an apocalypse, as the mainstream misrepresented it, but as a transition, a cycle completion, exactly as the Sumerian texts describe. The Vedic tradition's calculation of the Yuga cycle places us in the Kali Yuga's closing period, the time of maximum darkness before the dawn of the Satya Yuga. The Hopi tradition's prophecy of the fifth world. The Lakota tradition's description of the return of white buffalo calf woman. The Aboriginal Australian tradition's descriptions of the Dreamtime becoming accessible again. All of them, pointing here. If the Sumerians are a transmission, they are one channel in a multi-channel broadcast. The same message, encoded in every culture that had access to the long memory, sent forward through every medium available. Clay tablets, stone monuments, oral tradition, genetic memory, mathematical encoding, astronomical alignment. Every channel sending the same signal. And the signal says, now. The responsibility that comes with knowing or even suspecting what we've discussed in this video is not a small one. The questions it raises about human history, human identity, human potential, and the current moment are not casual questions. They are the questions that, once seriously engaged, reshape everything. That reshaping is not comfortable. The short memory, the conventional story of who we are and where we came from is a comfortable story. It is small enough to be manageable. It keeps the universe at a safe distance and keeps human history at a scale that doesn't overwhelm. The long memory is not comfortable. It is enormous. It places humanity in a cosmic context that is simultaneously humbling and empowering. It suggests that we are older than we know, more capable than we have been allowed to believe, and more directly implicated in the deep cycles of the solar system and the Earth than any conventional framework can accommodate. But discomfort is not a reason to look away. The Enki program, if that is what this is, has always been about the willingness to look, to see what is there, rather than what is comfortable. To carry the weight of knowing, rather than the lightness of not asking. You are watching this because some part of you already knows. Some part of you has always known that the official story is too small, that the universe is more than it has been presented to be, that you are more than you have been told you are. The clay tablets, 6,000 years old, pressed by hands that knew they were writing for you, say the same thing. The time is here. The memory is returning. The wheel has turned. Now comes the work of remembering and of building, in the new age that is beginning, a civilization worthy of the knowledge that was given and preserved across the long dark of human forgetting. The Sumerians did their part. They pressed the message into clay. They trusted that the clay would survive. It did. Now it's your turn.